Welcome, curious minds and fellow fans of the bizarre. Tonight, we're not just dipping our toes, we're diving headfirst into something truly horrifying for your delicate modern sensibilities. The grime, the grit, and the exceptionally questionable grooming habits of the Middle Ages. And look, I'll be real with you, you probably won't survive this. Not because it's terrifying, but because the sheer, slow, wonderfully detailed boredom of medieval daily life might just lull you into a coma. Perfect for sleep, really. So, before you get comfortably nestled on your modern-day longhouse bench, perhaps one that doesn't smell faintly of fermented sheep, do me a solid, hit that like button and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, which is mostly just making you appreciate your indoor plumbing. And seriously, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who else is winding down or just starting their chaotic day around the world, pondering the delightful odours of the 13th century. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, distant hum of absolutely nothing medieval actually. Imagine the silence broken only by distant pig grunts and the occasional rat scurrying. Let's ease into tonight's journey together, because what's better than an evening spent contemplating the intimate, unfiltered lives of people who used to think bad smells caused the plague? Exactly. Welcome to 1243, Your Nose Knows No Mercy. So imagine waking up, groggily, in the year 1243. Your straw mattress smells like, it's best not to describe it in detail, but let's just say it's a symphony of dampness, stale grain, and existential resignation. You slept in the same itchy wool tunic you wore yesterday, and the day before, and quite possibly the entire week before that. No judgment, darling. That's just how things go here. Laundry day is more of a vague aspiration than a regularly scheduled event. You sit up, scratch something you fervently hope isn't lice, but probably is, and the very first thing that assaults your senses is how profoundly, comprehensively bad everything smells. But here's the kicker. Strangely, you don't mind. Why? Because everyone smells bad. Not I forgot deodorant for a gym class bad. More like I rolled in a pile of fermented sheep dung and then got caught in a light rain bad. It's the baseline. It's the air you breathe, it's home. But here's the actual kicker. Despite what centuries of sensationalized history and terrible movies might have told you, people in the Middle Ages weren't entirely disgusting. You've probably heard the old rumour that they didn't bathe for months, even years. That's not entirely true. In fact, many people, especially those in cities or with a bit of coin, actually wanted to be clean. They frequented bathhouses, they had access to hot water if they could afford the exorbitant cost of firewood, and they used soaps made from animal fat and ash. More on that glorious creation later. The real challenge? Staying clean was like trying to dry off in a rainstorm while wearing a sponge suit. You'd wash, sure, but your clothes were still stiff with embedded grime. Your straw mattress was a bustling metropolis of fleas and bedbugs, and you lived next door to people who cheerfully tossed their chamber pot contents out the window every morning with a cheerful "Gardyloo." So, yeah, personal hygiene was less about achieving sparkling cleanliness and more about simply trying your best in a losing, uphill, and profoundly stinky battle. It was a valiant, if ultimately doomed effort. Monks, mud, and medicinal scents, the hygiene spectrum. Interestingly, and perhaps surprisingly, medieval monks were often some of the cleanest folks around. Not because they harboured some secret passion for fresh linen and minty breath, but because religious rules demanded it. Monastic rules, like those of Saint Benedict, explicitly required hand-washing before meals and ritual foot-washing as a form of humble service. There's a sweet, almost sleepy image for you. A quiet, candlelit stone monastery, the flickering glow illuminating a line of robed monks humbly, silently washing each other's feet. Ah, spiritual cleanliness. But let's not romanticize it too much. Cleanliness was still very much a relative concept. Your average peasant might wash their face in a bucket of cold, questionable water once a week. That was often the extent of their bathing. And full baths? Those were almost universally communal, which meant sharing increasingly cloudy water with your entire family, or, if you lived in a bustling village, half the town. Picture a medieval hot tub party minus the jets, the fun, the music, and plus some actual frogs and floating debris. Not exactly a relaxing spa experience. And you've got to remember this crucial point. The pervasive smell of dirty was totally, utterly normal. Think about it. If your entire world smells like sweat, mud, unwashed animals, wood smoke, and questionable human byproducts, that's just baseline. It's not offensive, it's just the atmospheric condition. It's what homey smells like. In fact, the only people who really got sniffed at, quite literally, were those who dared to smell different. This would include wealthy nobles dousing themselves in expensive imported rose water or rare exotic perfumes from the Middle East. To your average medieval peasant, that strange, overpowering floral scent was totally suspicious, perhaps even a little witchy. Why does Lord Reginald smell like a flower garden? Is he trying to trick us? Is he hiding something? Public baths. From social clubs to sinful pits. Thanks, plague. Now let's talk about public bathhouses. These were surprisingly common, especially in thriving medieval cities like Paris, London, and across parts of the Islamic world, which, it must be noted, often boasted vastly superior hygiene standards than much of Europe. People flocked to bathhouses not just to soak, but to gossip, eat snacks, conduct business, and, well, engage in other things. Yeah, bathhouses weren't always just about squeaky clean skin. Some evolved into bustling social clubs, and many, especially in larger, less regulated cities, became thinly veiled fronts for brothels. Unsurprisingly, this rather scandalous reputation didn't sit well with the increasingly powerful and perpetually worried church leaders. They preached loudly and frequently that bathhouses were dens of sin, temptation, and probably the preferred lurking grounds of Satan himself, just waiting to offer you a towel. By the 14th century, that growing reputation for promiscuity and vice, combined with the terrifying and utterly incomprehensible outbreak of the Black Death, led to a mass closure of many public bathhouses across Europe. People suddenly became absolutely terrified that bathing somehow opened your pores to disease. A hot bath wasn't a cleansing act. It was like shouting, "Come on in, bubonic plague. I just exfoliated for you." This kicked off one of the most uncomfortably ironic public health trends ever, actively avoiding baths on purpose to avoid getting sick. Why expose yourself? Instead, you just scrub your exposed skin with linen cloths and douse yourself in more perfume. The phrase, "better safe than sudsy," may not have existed, but that was undeniably the vibe. This fear was largely fueled by the pervasive miasma theory, the firmly held, completely wrong belief that bad smells caused disease. Not germs, those hadn't been discovered yet, just foul, putrid air, that rotting pile of cabbage in the alley. Dangerous. A particularly pungent goat in the courtyard. Possibly fatal. So, instead of cleaning the source of the stink, people focused entirely on covering it up with even stronger scents. They hung sweet-smelling posies from their belts, stuffed fragrant herbs into their clothes, think medieval potpourri as body armour, and burned vast quantities of incense indoors. Did it work? Absolutely not. But it made you feel like you were doing something. And sometimes, in the terrifying uncertainty of the Middle Ages, that was enough. In wealthier homes, they might even sprinkle rose petals on the floor to release a pleasant scent when stepped on. Kind of sweet, right? Until you remember they were trying to mask the stench of spilled food, pervasive mold, and probably something unspeakable oozing from the corner. Still, points for effort, and for providing a fleeting moment of deceptive aromatherapy. And here's a fun, albeit slightly perplexing, fringe fact for you. Medieval people widely believed that rubbing one's body vigorously with dry cloths was actually better than washing with water. The idea was that water softened the skin, made it weak, and opened the body to illness. So, rubbing your armpits with a dry, slightly gritty rag, that was your shower. It was kind of like medieval Febreze, tackling the problem without addressing the underlying dampness. Of course, there's a lot scholars still debate about medieval hygiene. Did peasants really avoid bathing for months? Or were their habits simply invisible to the record-keeping nobles and clergy? Did more frequent washing survive in warmer climates? How much of what we know comes from post-medieval writers trying to make their ancestors look backward and silly for comedic effect? Like most things in history, It's complicated, messy, and probably far smellier than we'll ever fully grasp. But for now, you've taken your first slow, cautious, and slightly itchy step into a world where hygiene is both strangely familiar and weirdly off. A world where people constantly tried to stay clean in a place, constantly trying to make them dirty again. Where washing your hands could be a holy act or a wasteful, dangerous act. And if you think this was gross, just wait until we get to teeth. Toothworms, urine mouthwash, and the joys of medieval dentistry. Ah, your teeth. You don't know why exactly, but there's this constant, dull, throbbing ache in your molars that makes you clench your jaw every time you try to chew something harder than boiled oats, which is, tragically, most things. But it's 1287, and unless you happen to know a barber surgeon who isn't hopelessly drunk that day, you're just stuck with it. Toothache is just part of life, like perpetually cold feet, suspicious lumps in your stew, and the nagging fear of eternal damnation. Welcome to medieval dental hygiene, where nobody's smiling much, and if they are, it's probably because they lost all their teeth years ago and now enjoy a glorious, pain-free gumming experience. You might assume the Middle Ages were a total dental disaster, a graveyard of rotten stumps and chronic agony. And yeah, kind of. But not always in the way you'd expect. In some ways, they actually had a head start. You see, sugar wasn't widely available in Europe until the very late Middle Ages, and even then, it was ludicrously expensive, mostly imported, and consumed almost exclusively by the super wealthy. So, for most peasants, it wasn't sugar that rotted their teeth into oblivion. It was time, grit, the sheer wear and tear of age, and, somewhat tragically, the fact that their daily bread was often ground with primitive millstones that left behind tiny abrasive specks of stone dust. Which means, yes, your rustic, wholesome daily loaf of bread might actually be sanding down your tooth enamel with every single chew. Delicious, yet destructive. As for actual cleaning, well, they tried. Tooth powders made from crushed herbs like mint, sage, or simple salt were used by those who could afford or access them. Sometimes people would rub their teeth with a linen cloth dipped in vinegar. Sounds refreshing, right? Until you realize vinegar's acid probably made things significantly worse in the long run, eroding that already beleaguered enamel. Some adventurous souls even chewed on twigs using the frayed ends like a primitive toothbrush. Honestly, not a bad idea. Modern miswak sticks work similarly. So, not everything was terrible. Just, most of it. Now, brace yourself, because here comes a fringe practice that's going to stick in your brain like a particularly stubborn bit of gristle. Some medieval folks rinsed their mouths with urine. Human urine. Yeah. Apparently, aged urine left to sit for a while was considered a legitimate cleansing agent. The ammonia content is, legitimately, very strong. Whether it truly helped teeth or just burned everything into glorious, merciful numbness is up for debate. Either way, it's a routine that makes modern mouthwash commercials feel like episodes of Star Trek. And if you had a cavity, well, they didn't call it a cavity. You had a toothworm. Yes, a literal, tiny worm. The prevailing idea was that a minuscule, malevolent creature had burrowed into your tooth and was wriggling around in there, causing all that excruciating pain. There are written accounts of desperate people trying to lure the toothworm out with burning herbs, pungent smoke, and even music. Music! As if a microscopic worm was just hanging out in your incisor, waiting to hear its favourite lute tune before packing its tiny bags and moving on to the next unsuspecting molar. When toothaches became truly unbearable, or a tooth needed to come out, you went to the barber surgeon. These were the multi-talented guys who also did bloodletting, amputations, set broken bones, and whatever else needed doing between haircuts and shaves. If a tooth needed pulling, they'd pry it out with ominous iron tongs and zero anaesthetic. Just a good grip, a strong arm, and maybe a friend to hold your shoulders down while you screamed. Definitely not a fun day at the office. But afterward, you might get a generous glass of ale and the vague, comforting promise that at least that one wouldn't hurt anymore. Small mercies. Of course, not everyone had the same dental experience. Monks, again, were often better off thanks to their structured diets and access to various herbal remedies. Nobles, on the other hand, could afford exotic and expensive sweets, as well as preserved fruits soaked in honey. which ironically wrecked their teeth far faster than a peasant's grain-laden diet. Archaeological evidence actually backs this up. Many high-status skulls from the late Middle Ages show severe tooth decay, while peasant remains often reveal worn-down but surprisingly cavity-free teeth. So, maybe you were lucky to be poor, tooth-wise. Anyway, there's also something oddly comforting in knowing that even back then people worried about their appearance. Bad breath was still profoundly embarrassing. Some medieval guides actually recommended chewing fennel seeds or cloves to freshen up before speaking with others, particularly those of higher status or potential romantic interest. There's something kind of timeless about a peasant nervously popping a clove before trying to talk to their crush at the market. Same insecurity, different millennium, infinitely worse smells. Of course, scholars still argue about just how widespread these practices really were. Were mouth-cleaning rituals just for the literate upper classes who wrote about them? Or did ordinary people have their own unwritten traditions passed down orally? There's evidence from other cultures that chewing sticks and herbal remedies were common hygiene tools globally, so it's likely that some version of these existed across medieval Europe, even if they didn't make it into the dusty records we now read by candlelight. And while dental hygiene was hit or miss, teeth themselves played weird, almost magical roles in medieval life. People believed toothaches could be cured by wearing certain amulets, like a wolf's tooth strung around your neck, or by reciting specific prayers to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches, who, no surprise here, had her own teeth violently removed as part of her martyrdom, because apparently pain and holiness were deeply intertwined. Oh, and just for fun, one bizarre medical text even suggested planting a pulled tooth in a field and letting it grow to remove the ache. Like dental farming. There's no evidence this ever worked, obviously, but there's a melancholic comfort in imagining some poor guy burying his molar in a patch of barley and praying for relief. It's desperate, it's sad, and it's a little poetic. So tonight, as you lie in bed, with your comfortable, minty toothpaste, and your gently humming electric toothbrush safely tucked away, just know that you're living in peak dental luxury. No worms, no vinegar burns, no early morning tongs to the jaw, just smooth enamel and maybe a late night snack without fear of triggering medieval level mouth agony. And if you do have a toothache, at least you don't have to play the flute at it. Count your blessings. Welcome to the bathhouse, lukewarm human soup and moral dilemmas. It's early morning in your little medieval town, and you're heading to the bathhouse. In theory, this should be relaxing. Warm water, the chance for clean skin, maybe even scrubbing off that persistent livestock aroma you've accumulated this week. But of course, this is the Middle Ages, so things are all going to get weird fast. You walk into a steamy wooden building, your breath catching from the unsettling mix of moist heat and pervasive human musk. And suddenly you're surrounded by half-naked people. Men, women, sometimes children, lounging in giant wooden tubs, chatting loudly about everything from taxes to saints to someone's suspicious new mole. It's less spa day with soothing aromatherapy and more lukewarm human soup with conversational side dishes. Bathhouses were surprisingly common in medieval towns, especially in places like England, France and the Low Countries, and they weren't just for the upper crust either. Labourers, merchants, even peasants scraped together the occasional coin for a communal soak. Some cities had dozens of them, sometimes as popular or even more popular than taverns. And if you're picturing rows of private porcelain baths and soothing harp music, no. This was a loud, social, slightly chaotic space. People bathed together, often men and women alike in many cases, and nobody was in a rush. You were here to soak, gossip, perhaps nibble some bread and cheese while you slowly pruned up like a neglected raisin. But that innocent loaf of bread leads us directly to the more fringe and historically problematic aspect of bathhouses. They often doubled as places of business and pleasure. In many towns, bathhouses quickly developed an unsavoury reputation for mixing cleanliness with carnality. The line between a steam room and a steamy, illicit situation blurred pretty fast, especially in larger, less regulated urban centres. This, as you can imagine, did not sit well with the increasingly puritanical church, who preached loudly and frequently that bathhouses were dens of sin, temptation, and probably the preferred hangout spots for Satan himself. lurking behind a curtain with a suspiciously clean towel. By the 14th century, especially during the terrifying times of plague, bathhouses were scrutinized, shut down, or heavily regulated. The idea that hot water opened pores and thus invited disease became a powerful, albeit scientifically wrong, medical theory. Still, despite the Church's condemnations and the new health fears, people loved them. Because let's be honest, the rest of medieval life was freezing, muddy, perpetually smelly, and often excruciatingly painful. A hot bath, even one shared with strangers, a few fleas and the occasional frog, was a tiny, exquisite luxury in a world of profound discomfort. And these weren't tiny tubs either. Some bathhouses featured huge communal wooden vats, sometimes heated from below with actual fires, creating vast pools of warm water. You'd soak, then perhaps step onto a platform to be scrubbed down vigorously with rough linen cloths, often by an attendant who may or may not have been trained in the delicate art of not hurting you. The idea was to get all that dead skin, soot and accumulated grime off, and believe me, they did not believe in gentle exfoliation. The goal was to scrape you clean like a well-used soup pot. For a few coins more, you could even get scented oils rubbed onto your skin. Imported lavender, rosemary, rosewater, whatever was locally available or could be sourced through trade. It sounds fancy, but it wasn't just about smelling nice. Remember miasma theory? Bad smells equal sickness. Good smells equal protection. So, slathering yourself in strong-smelling herbs and oils was kind of like putting on medieval hand sanitizer, even if the science didn't quite hold up to modern scrutiny. Here's something even stranger. Bathhouses sometimes offered food service. You could literally eat a meal in the tub, surrounded by other steamy, pruning bodies. Stew in one hand, a hunk of bread in the other, gossip bouncing off the wooden walls. There's a quiet, strangely appealing charm to that image. Steam drifting up to the rafters, the clink of wooden bowls, someone snorting mid-laugh as another person tries to convince them the butcher's apprentice is secretly a nobleman in disguise. But not all baths were in towns. Some people, especially in rural areas, made do with large wooden tubs at home, or even brave outdoor rivers if the weather allowed and decency was less of a concern. These were more private affairs, but still not what we'd call sanitary. Water was hauled from a well, reused multiple times, and probably shared with the entire household in sequence. You'd definitely want to be the first one in. By the fourth person, that water was more stew than bath water. And speaking of stew, let's not forget what happened after you got out. You didn't have fluffy towels and a plush robe waiting. More likely, you dried off with something scratchy and perhaps still damp from last time. Then you put your same old grimy clothes back on, because clean outfits were a luxury only the truly wealthy enjoyed. So yes, you were technically cleaner, but still wearing that tunic that had absorbed 3 months of goat-based living. There's one particularly strange record from 15th century Germany, where couples were actually encouraged to bathe together before marriage. Kind of sweet, right? A joint, pre-wedding scrub to cleanse the body and soul for matrimony. But it wasn't just symbolic. People believed shared bathing could promote harmony, intimacy, and perhaps ensure the couple smelled equally tolerable for marital bliss. Still, scholars debate a lot about how often people really bathed. The records are patchy, and what survives often reflects urban or noble life. Rural folk may have washed less, or simply done it differently, in ways not recorded. Some historians argue the idea of rare bathing was exaggerated by later writers trying to make their ancestors look primitive, a sort of historical shaming. Others think the bathhouse culture was genuinely vibrant and widespread, until diseases like the plague and syphilis turned water into a threat instead of a cure. And there's that ever-present fear: open pores. By the late 14th century, more and more people believed that hot baths left you vulnerable to disease. Open pores meant bad air, filled with pestilence, could sneak directly into your body. So, ironically, the very act of cleaning yourself was seen as a health risk. Over time, many people started wiping themselves down with cloths instead of immersing in water. Dry bathing, less effective, more socially acceptable, and much, much sadder. So here you are, slowly drying off next to a stranger who just offered you a hunk of bread, thinking, maybe life isn't so bad. Until you remember you've got to walk home in the freezing wind. and that you'll be sleeping in the same lice-prone woolens you arrived in. But for a few fleeting moments, you were warm, you were cleanish, you were part of a world that knew how to turn communal discomfort into a kind of strange, shared comfort. Just try not to think too hard about what's floating in the tub. Soap, the greasy, gritty, slightly dangerous medieval luxury. The soap you're using tonight, if you're even lucky enough to have it, could probably strip paint off a wagon wheel. It's gritty, slightly greasy, and smells like a mix of wood ash and something that tragically died last Tuesday. But in the Middle Ages, this stuff is as close to luxury as it gets. Because here's the thing, soap wasn't always a household staple. It was an ordeal. Part chemistry experiment, part kitchen fire hazard, and depending on where you lived, it might also be considered suspiciously exotic. Let's dig into the scratchy, sudsy, vaguely dangerous world of medieval soap making. First off, soap wasn't new. People in ancient Rome, Mesopotamia, and even early Celtic tribes had versions of it. But by the early Middle Ages, much of that knowledge got patchy, becoming localized and rudimentary. In most places, soap was made in big, smelly batches by boiling animal fat, usually goat or cow tallow, sometimes even pig fat, with ashes. You had to meticulously collect wood ash from hardwoods, oak or beech were preferred, then mix it with water to make lye. Yes, lye. The caustic, burn-your-skin-off chemical that still comes with warning labels and hazmat suits today. The process was decidedly not gentle, and if you got the proportions wrong, your homemade soap either wouldn't clean anything at all, or it would take a literal layer of skin off along with the dirt. So, congratulations. You're standing in your grimy cottage, sweating over a cauldron full of bubbling tallow and lye, desperately trying not to poison yourself while making what might turn out to be medieval napalm in bar form. Not exactly a Pinterest craft. That's why soap making often became a specialised trade in cities like Marseille, Aleppo, and Venice. Professional soap makers, often operating under strict guild supervision, refined the craft and produced better quality bars. Some were even scented with olive oil or imported herbs. These soaps were smoother, more fragrant, and wildly expensive. If you had one of these at home, it meant you were probably a wealthy merchant, a high-ranking noble, or married to someone who could successfully dodge taxes and smuggle luxury goods. Most people, though, used the homemade, often harsh stuff, or they didn't use soap at all, and just scrubbed themselves with rough cloth, sand, or handfuls of straw. Yes, straw. Talk about exfoliation. Interestingly, in Islamic regions of the medieval world, soap making was far more advanced. They perfected recipes using vegetable oils, particularly olive oil, and introduced techniques that produced softer, less caustic, and more pleasant bars. These superior soaps made their way to Europe through trade and conquest, and for a while, using that kind of refined soap was seen as foreign, sophisticated, and for some, slightly suspect, because nothing says luxury hygiene like a bar of imported Aleppo soap that your neighbour secretly believes is a tool of the devil. That's not an exaggeration either. Soap had an awkward reputation in some Christian circles. Some scholars and zealous preachers associated cleanliness with vanity and vanity with sin. So, smelling nice or scrubbing too often might earn you a few judgmental stares at church. There were even sermons specifically warning women against perfume temptation and men against softness of the flesh, which, translated, meant stop moisturizing, or God might notice your supple skin. Still, people made soap anyway, especially in towns where you couldn't just roll in the river mud and call it a day. They used what they had, pig fat, wood ash, and water, and the result? An incredibly hard, often stinky substance that sometimes worked and sometimes just made your skin feel like it was being punished. But hey, better than nothing. Soap also had other, weirdly specific uses. Some texts mention using strong soap to treat lice infestations or various skin conditions. In other cases, soap was a crucial part of purification rituals. Monks, for instance, religiously washed their hands and faces before prayer, often using specific soaps made in monastic workshops. These were basic, no frills, but symbolically important, as part of a larger practice of spiritual cleanliness. Because if the body was a temple, even a very smelly one, it deserved a little lye-based maintenance now and then. But you want quirky? Let's go extra fringe. There's a surviving medieval recipe for soap that includes ox bile, ashes of burned grapevine, and, wait for that, goose grease. The instructions are vague, the quantities are nonsensical, and the warnings are non-existent. But someone wrote it down, which means someone made it and quite possibly survived using it. Barely. Now imagine being a peasant trying to store this homemade bar of experimental sludge. You didn't have a ceramic soap dish. You had maybe a damp corner of your shared sleeping space or a kitchen shelf near the turnips. And over time, your precious soap bar would get weirdly soft, start melting into a slimy grey puddle, or dry into a rock-hard slab that could double as a weapon in a tavern brawl. There's also a debate among modern scholars about just how widespread regular soap use actually was. Some argue it was largely a luxury, used more for laundry than for personal hygiene. Others believe it was more common than we think, but simply underrepresented in written records, which tend to focus on elites and church practices. Maybe everyone had some rough chunk of it drying by the fire, but nobody thought to mention it because, well, it was just soap. Not exciting, unless of course it exploded, and that's something worth remembering. The past wasn't all filth and ignorance. People wanted to be clean. They figured things out, mostly through trial and error, and let's be honest, mostly error. But still, that humble, stinky bar of soap in your imagination right now, that was effort. That was time. That was animal fat rendered over hours, probably while kids screamed and the dog tried to eat the cooling lye bucket. So tonight, as you lather up in your perfectly balanced coconut-scented body wash, just picture some medieval villager standing by a bubbling cauldron of goat fat and firewood smoke, squinting into the steam and muttering, maybe if I add more ash, just a little more. They didn't have pH strips or lab coats, just hope, a high tolerance for burns, and the distant dream of smelling marginally less like livestock. And maybe, just maybe, their hands came out a little cleaner, if they didn't melt first. Public pee, when waste disposal was out of sight, out the window. It's early morning in your little medieval town and something wet and undeniably odorous sloshes past your front door. You hear the unmistakable splash, a squelch, maybe even a startled yell from a passerby who wasn't fast enough with their reflexes. You don't panic. That's just someone dumping their chamber pot into the street again. Business as usual. Because in the Middle Ages, waste disposal was basically out of sight, out the window. There were no flush toilets, of course. No indoor plumbing as we know it. No tidy porcelain thrones to sit upon while contemplating life. What you had, if you were lucky, was a chamber pot, a simple ceramic or wooden bowl you tucked under the bed or beside a stool. You did your business there, day or night, in relative privacy. And when it got full, you, or more likely, someone in your household, read, the youngest, lowest ranking, or most desperately unlucky person would chuck it out the window, preferably after yelling something like "Gardez-le," from the French garde à l'eau, meaning watch out for the water, or below, to warn anyone walking past. Hopefully they got out of the way in time. If not, well, unfortunate. The streets themselves weren't paved in most towns and certainly not cleaned often. They were a delightful organic combination of mud, horse droppings, discarded straw, rotting food scraps, and, of course, the daily liquid contribution from your upstairs neighbour's bladder. Many towns had a central gutter or kennel designed to carry waste downhill, and in theory, away from town. In practice, that gutter often clogged, backed up, and frequently became a putrid, stinking ribbon winding through the very heart of the city. The smell? Imagine a compost pile having a heated argument with a wet, angry dog. But worse. Much, much worse. Now let's talk about the unsung, utterly essential heroes of medieval sanitation. The night soil men. These were the folks, usually paid very little and often ostracised, who bravely ventured out after dark to empty cesspits and privies, especially in larger towns and castles. They worked in the cloak of night, silently hauling barrels of human waste to designated dumps or fields outside the city, where, if you can believe it, it was sometimes used as fertilizer. Yes, your wholesome medieval lettuce may have enjoyed a generous helping of Lord Melvin's fermented leftovers. Night soil men were absolutely essential for public health, but also deeply looked down upon. People avoided them in public, yet relied on them completely. A truly thankless job, if ever there was one. If you were lucky enough to live in a castle or a large manor with some actual infrastructure, you might have access to a garderobe. This was a narrow little stone room built into the castle or manor walls, with a simple hole that dropped waste directly into the moat below, or into a dedicated pit. There's even a delightful archaeological term for the build-up that collected in those pits over decades or centuries. Cess sludge. Thick, dark, and incredibly valuable to archaeologists today, who meticulously dig through it for clues about medieval diet, prevalent diseases, and even the parasites that plagued our ancestors. You're welcome, future scholars, for your contribution to science. Now, here's a fringe fact you'll probably wish you didn't know, but you're here for the gritty truth. Some garderobes were deliberately designed above the kitchens. That's right. The idea, bafflingly, was that the heat from the kitchen fires below would warm the stone seat, a tiny luxury, and perhaps help with the smell. Spoiler alert, it didn't. There's something deeply, existentially unsettling about performing a basic bodily function directly above where the day's soup is simmering. Just try to unimagine that. But let's say you lived in the countryside, far from any castle or city, with no chamber pot to call your own, just fields stretching out around you. What did you do then? You found a bush, or a tree, you dug a hole, or, quite often, you simply didn't. Open defecation was common, especially among poorer folk. They didn't have the luxury of designated waste areas, and there wasn't much inherent shame in it either. It was just something you did quickly, hopefully not directly in view of your neighbour's prize cow. It was an entirely different world, where sanitation was a distant, smelly concept. Hello, and welcome. Tonight we're stepping into a time where being a queen meant wearing 10 pounds of brocade, while silently enduring political chess matches where you were often the piece, not the player. Welcome to medieval royalty, where your crown is heavy, your smile is rehearsed. And yes, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love knowing who's on the other side of this journey. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're 13, maybe 14, and someone just told you you're getting married. You're a noble girl, maybe a princess, maybe the daughter of a minor king, and you're about to become a medieval queen. Romantic, right? No. This isn't love, it's politics through and through. Your future husband is chosen for what he can offer your father. Land, troops, a treaty, or maybe it's just an end to a blood feud that's been going on longer than you've been alive. Your opinion isn't just not required, it's not even considered. If you protest too much, you risk dishonouring your family, and you know how that ends. Spoiler, not well. You're packed off from your home with a procession of ox-drawn carts, dowry chests, and worried ladies-in-waiting who've been assigned to babysit you until the grave. Or worse, until your new court decides to swap them out for spies. Maybe you've met the king once, maybe not. Doesn't matter. You'll meet him again on your wedding day, under a canopy of incense and chanting monks in front of a crowd of strangers who can't wait to see if you cry. And you probably will, because this man isn't some dashing fairy tale prince. He's 35, grizzled from wars, maybe still married to someone else who's been conveniently locked in a convent. Or worse. Or he's a boy your age with just as little power and a court full of venomous old nobles using you both like dolls in a shadow play. Historically, this wasn't rare. Eleanor of Aquitaine was married to Louis VII of France at 15. She became Queen of France basically overnight. Her job, be beautiful, obedient, and give France an heir, in that exact order. Not that she obeyed any of it, by the way, but we'll get to her legendary rebellion later. Right now, your life is all about silks, sapphires, and suffocating responsibility. And the wedding? Let's not sugarcoat it. You walk down the nave in a gown that weighs more than your horse, embroidered with gold thread and lined in squirrel fur. Sounds luxurious until you realize medieval laundry was, inconsistent. You may look radiant, but you smell like beeswax, old lavender, and stress sweat. Everyone's watching. Everyone! The bishop, your future in-laws, the servants pressed against the back walls trying to catch a glimpse of the spectacle. After the vows and rings, maybe a crown if they're feeling generous. You're escorted to a room where, depending on how invasive the customs are, Your first night with your husband might be witnessed. No, not metaphorically. There's an entire tradition in some courts of having noble witnesses observe the newlyweds being put to bed, and even a sheet check the next morning to prove the marriage was consummated. Sleep well. The weirdest part? Your family likely trained you for this moment. You were raised in a chamber near the women's quarters, taught to read just enough to recite psalms, trained in needlework and decorum. But no one told you how terrifying it would be to kneel beside a man who can literally sentence people to death and call him your beloved lord. You might not speak his language. You probably don't know what kind of ruler he is. And you're expected to share his bed, smile like it's an honor, and get to work on making babies immediately. The power imbalance is staggering. But here's the twist. Queens weren't always powerless. In fact, many wielded incredible soft power through influence, alliances, and religious networks. But in the beginning, as a teenager dropped into a foreign court with different food, strange customs, and possibly even hostile nobility, you're more decorative than decisive. And yet, there's something surreal about it too. You're handed a crown, draped in cloaks worth more than a farm, and referred to as Her Grace by people who a week ago didn't know you existed. Your name changes, your coat of arms is redrawn, your past absorbed into your husband's world. This isn't just a marriage, it's a rebranding. You're not a daughter anymore, you're property, carefully placed atop the chessboard of European dynasties. Sometimes you're lucky, maybe your husband is kind, maybe the court respects you, maybe you learn to speak the language, make allies, and even carve out a space of your own. But don't get too comfortable. Your womb is now a matter of state. Your first duty is to have a male heir, preferably yesterday. Everything else is just window dressing. One fringe fact, in some royal weddings, the bride was literally carried to bed in a ritual known as the bedding ceremony, complete with songs, jokes, and awkward nudging from older relatives. The entire court treated it like the grand finale of a banquet. Imagine that as a teenager. Scholars still debate whether queens were pawns or players in this system. Some insist they were nothing more than vessels for heirs and peace treaties. Others argue that, despite restrictions, they often held real sway, especially if they managed to outlive their husbands or raise powerful sons. But tonight, you're just a young queen sitting on the edge of an unfamiliar bed, staring at tapestries you don't recognize, trying not to cry. And guess what? It only gets more complicated from here. The next morning, sunlight pours through stained glass windows you don't recognize, casting jewel-toned shadows across a stone floor that's colder than your nerves. You're awake far too early, muscles aching from the stiff ceremonial bedding, and already the court is bustling with whispered gossip and clipped footsteps. Why? Because today, your dowry becomes official. And let's be honest, no one in this castle cares more about you than they do about what you're worth. The dowry isn't just a polite thank you for taking you off your father's hands. It's a carefully calculated package of wealth, land, titles, and sometimes entire cities. You are a geopolitical transaction in pearls and velvet. It's possible your dowry was discussed for years before you even hit puberty. And now, with the marriage complete in the most awkward sense, the accounts are due. Clerks in itchy robes hunch over parchment, squabbling over exactly how many cows or manors equate to your hand in marriage. Some royal dowries were absolutely bonkers. Margaret of Denmark, for instance, brought the entire Orkney and Shetland Islands as part of hers. Imagine being so valuable that whole chunks of the North Sea came with your wedding vows. Meanwhile, in France or England, the dowry could include jewellery, spices, bolts of cloth, and thousands of gold coins. An actual line item might be 12 gowns embroidered with peacock feathers. And this stuff wasn't symbolic, it mattered. If the dowry fell short or was delayed, it could spark a war. Yep, a war over your missing embroidery thread. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Your value is now locked into this transaction. If your dowry was large and paid on time, congratulations, you're a prized political asset. If your father shortchanged your husband or reneged on promises, you're officially the most expensive disappointment in court. No pressure. But it gets trickier. The dowry isn't just a one-way street. There's also something called a dower, which is what your husband promises you in return, sort of a just in case he dies horribly in battle fund. It usually includes lands or income-producing properties that you'll inherit if you outlive him. Of course, whether you'll actually get those lands, well, that depends on your husband's mood, your popularity, and how many scheming in-laws want those assets for themselves. There's a fringe historical tidbit here that's kind of hilarious in a grim way. Some dowries were detailed down to the number of undergarments included. Like your father might have sent a full accounting of your trousseau, including how many linen shifts you brought, and whether they were laced with gold thread. Some of these inventories have survived, and yes, they are weirdly specific. It's like reading a medieval fashion hall on parchment. The moment this transactional dance is complete, you officially belong to your husband's household. Your loyalties shift instantly, whether your heart has or not. And here's where it gets wildly awkward. Sometimes your father and husband hate each other, like deeply, but that doesn't matter anymore. You have to play nice, stay neutral, and most importantly, produce heirs. That's the only part of the deal that can't be written on parchment, so everyone's watching, waiting to see if you start showing signs of pregnancy. Fast. Oh, and don't expect privacy. Courtiers love to speculate. There's even a term for the flurry of surveillance queens faced after their weddings, the queen's bloom. Everyone wants to know when you'll bloom into motherhood. If you sneeze at breakfast or skip a wine goblet, whispers swirl like storm clouds. Some queens even faked early pregnancies to buy themselves time. Others miscarried in secret just to avoid court humiliation. You might try to focus on something less overwhelming, like settling into your new chambers. But even that's fraught. Your rooms are richly decorated, yes. Gilded wall panels, carved bedposts, rugs imported from Byzantium. But you're not alone in them, ever. Your ladies-in-waiting sleep nearby, servants shuffle in and out without knocking, and everything you say can and will be repeated. Still, you try to take control of what you can. Maybe you ask for your favourite psalter to be placed by your bedside. Maybe you commission a tapestry depicting your family crest to remind everyone, including yourself, where you came from. Little acts of self-assertion can go a long way, but you learn quickly. Don't overdo it. Being too proud is risky, especially if you're a foreign queen. People want you to be dignified, not defiant. Here's a scholarly debate that never quite gets settled. Were dowries empowering or dehumanizing? Some historians argue that because the dowry often came with land rights and income, it gave queens leverage within the royal household. Others counter that the whole system reduced women to literal price tags. You might find truth in both views. After all, you've got land and jewels, but also about as much autonomy as a decorative tablecloth. And then, of course, there's the awkward reality that you might be used again. If this marriage fails, say your husband dies suddenly or the alliance falls apart, you can be shipped off and married again, sometimes to someone even older or with fewer teeth. Your dowry might be renegotiated like a used goods exchange. The only thing more unstable than a political marriage is a second political marriage. Yay, but for now, you smile, sit upright at feasts, and pretend the sausages and honeyed almonds make it all feel normal. You clasp your goblet with elegant fingers and laugh politely at jokes you barely understand. Every gesture is watched, every misstep judged, every moment documented, sometimes literally in court records or chroniclers' scrolls. Because you're no longer a person. You're a symbol, a treaty, a gilded link between two unstable kingdoms, and as exhausting as all that is, it's just the beginning. The first time you see the castle that's now your home, you expect something majestic. Maybe soaring towers, lush gardens, polished stone glowing in the afternoon light. What you get instead is something out of a chilly dream. Cold walls, grey skies, the air thick with damp moss and suspicion. The castle isn't built for comfort, it's built to withstand sieges, and now you live here. Congratulations, the arrival at court is theatre, make no mistake. The entire court turns out to greet you, though no one smiles too widely. Banners fly, trumpets blare, and children are scrubbed within an inch of their lives, just to stand in a muddy courtyard waving sprigs of rosemary. You ride in, stiff in the saddle, posture perfect. Your gown probably weighs 30 pounds, and underneath you're bracing against saddle sores and a cold wind that cuts through your silk-lined sleeves like a knife. But you can't flinch. Queens don't flinch. At the castle gates, your husband or future husband, depending on how drawn out the wedding festivities are, greets you with ceremonial gestures, a kiss on the cheek, a quick touch of the hand if he's bold. Maybe he lifts your veil in front of the crowd, but you're already scanning the faces behind him. That's your real concern. Who's watching you with narrowed eyes? Who's smiling a little too much? Because the moment you cross that threshold, you're not just a guest. You're an intruder in someone else's world. The court is a hive of activity. Men in embroidered tunics bow stiffly. Women in heavy wimples exchange glances, and servants skitter like mice behind the scenes. You're introduced with all the usual pomp. Her Royal Grace, Queen of such and such, Lady of this and that. It takes a full 2 minutes just to say your title, but every word reminds everyone exactly what price you fetched. That title is sewn into your identity now, whether you like it or not. Inside, the place smells like burning tallow, wet stone, and whatever the kitchen is stewing for tonight's feast, which could be anything from spiced rabbit to eel pie. The walls are lined with tapestries that look warm but don't really help against the draught. Your rooms, what they call the Queen's apartments, are secluded enough to keep you from the general rabble, but not so private that gossip can't sneak in through the floorboards. And here's the kicker. You don't know anyone. Not really? Maybe your new mother-in-law, if she's still alive and hasn't been packed off to a nunnery. Maybe your ladies-in-waiting, if your father managed to send a few you trust. But most of the people around you? Strangers. Ambitious, gossipy, power-sniffing strangers. And you're a teenage queen with no allies, no experience, and no idea which fork to use for salted trout. A real-life example of this cold welcome. Anne of Bohemia, when she arrived in England to marry King Richard II, people openly mocked her dowry, calling it worthless. She didn't even speak English. She was thrust into a world where her new subjects expected miracles and instant charm, and she delivered neither, at least not at first. It took years for her to win people over, and you will try too. You'll smile politely at barons who ogle you, ask careful questions about local saints, compliment tapestries even when they're ugly. Everything is performance, and the worst part, the performance never ends. You're not allowed to sulk or snap or ask to go home, not unless you want to start a diplomatic incident. Oh, and you quickly realize that every step you take is being watched. Not metaphorically, literally. There are eyes in the walls, not magic, just very bored, very nosy servants who report to higher-ranking courtiers, who in turn feed information to the king's advisors, and eventually to the king himself. Did the queen eat her figs at breakfast? Did she talk too long with the Spanish envoy? Did she wear blue on a feast day? All noted, all discussed in hushed tones over spiced wine. But let's zoom in on the servants for a moment, because this is where things get weird. Some are devoted, some resentful, and some are just there. One might be a peasant girl who's never left her village before being promoted to chambermaid. Another could be the bastard daughter of a noble family with nowhere else to go. And a few, full-on spies. Some sent by your own family, some by your enemies, and some just nosy opportunists with good ears and long memories. The fringe fact here, in some medieval courts, queens were expected to keep their own miniature household within the larger royal household. Think of it like a secret club with its own budget, hierarchy, and drama. You manage your own maids, scribes, cooks, and confessor. Sounds empowering, until you realize any one of them might betray you the moment it benefits someone higher up the chain. Meanwhile, your new subjects are watching too, and they have opinions. If you're from a foreign land, you're immediately suspected of trying to corrupt the court with foreign ideas, or worse, foreign fashions. They whisper that you bring omens, that your accent means your prayers don't count, that your foreign ways are a sign of secret sin. Even if you're kind and generous, rumours cling to you like damp wool. This brings us to a long-standing scholarly debate. Were foreign queens more vulnerable or more powerful because of their outsider status? Some say they had fewer political allies and were easy scapegoats. Others argue that their unique background gave them a rare independence from local factions. In your case, it just feels like being isolated in a room full of people who all know something you don't. But still, you settle in. You memorize names. You learn which corners of the castle stay warmest at night. You start eating like the locals, sort of. You practice curtsies in front of the looking-glass until your knees ache, and slowly, very slowly, the court begins to see you, not just as the new queen, but as their queen. Not that this makes things easier. In fact, it just means the real games are about to begin. Night falls heavy in the stone corridors of your new home, and while the day has been full of handshakes, veiled compliments, and trying not to trip over your own embroidery, tonight is something else entirely. Tonight is about duty, or, depending on which court gossip you listen to, spectacle. You're expected to do more than share a bed. You're expected to seal the marriage in a way that leaves no doubt, no legal loopholes, and no "we'll wait and see." Tonight, you're expected to consummate your union, and in some medieval courts, that expectation doesn't stop at the bedroom door. You've heard the whispers, of course. Some kingdoms go all in on the witnessed bedding ceremony. A crowd escorts you and your husband to the marriage bed with jokes, songs, and awkward blessings. Think of it as a medieval conga line, except it ends with you being undressed by your ladies while everyone else stands around pretending not to stare. In some places, the bedding itself was attended, though mercifully not always literally witnessed. Instead, the next morning, sheets were displayed, or midwives and matrons might be called to check for certain, signs of activity. You lie in bed, heart-pounding, draped in linens that smell like damp rosewater, and centuries of awkward history. Your husband lies beside you, possibly more nervous than you are, though he'd rather be thrown to the wolves than admit it. Whether he's gentle or cold, or fumbling or practiced, you're still a teenager, and no amount of training or advice can prepare you for the reality of being expected to perform intimacy with someone who was a stranger last week. This is not a honeymoon. It's a civic ritual, and while it's cloaked in lace and candles, it's ultimately about succession and legitimacy, not your feelings. This is what queens were trained for, even if no one said it out loud. You may have spent years learning courtly manners, religious verses, how to direct a household, but all of it leads to this, making sure the marriage is binding and productive. It's a terrifyingly thin line between beloved queen and political failure. You wake up the next morning under that same weight. You're a wife now, a potential mother, a state investment that needs to yield results. And people start watching you differently. The same courtiers who nodded politely yesterday now glance at your stomach when you pass, eyes flicking down as if your womb might announce its intentions by breakfast. Your maids whisper more, the ladies-in-waiting act more possessive, and your husband, well, he's probably off hawking or hunting, because the deed is done, and his role, at least for now, is considered fulfilled. You might not even be the only woman in his life. Medieval kings were not known for monogamy. Some had official mistresses, others just a rotating list of favourites, many of whom lived under the same roof. In some courts, the queen was expected to tolerate it. Open jealousy was not elegant. You're meant to be serene, divine, and above it all, even if your heart's breaking or your blood's boiling. And yet, some queens navigated this chaos with surprising agency. Take Isabella of France, for instance. Married to England's Edward II, who famously preferred the company of a certain male favourite, Isabella endured years of being sidelined before eventually leading a rebellion against her husband. Yep, the Queen led an actual coup. So while the first night might feel like the beginning of a lifetime of submission, that's not always how the story ends. But in this moment, that feels very far away. The court isn't done with you yet. After the marriage comes the public confirmation of your new role. You might be paraded through the streets in a gilded carriage, petals thrown at your feet, people cheering as if you've already delivered twins and saved the kingdom from plague. It's all part of the illusion. Queens aren't just figureheads. They're symbols of divine blessing. Your beauty, your poise, your fertility, all seen as signs that God favours the realm. No pressure. A fringe fact worth noting. In some traditions, a special cake or spice bread was served the day after the wedding, and everyone would toast to your hypothetical future children. Sometimes there were even fertility symbols baked into the crust, because what's more charming than cutting into a cake and finding a little golden baby charm staring up at you? But don't be fooled. Under all this pomp lies a harsh truth. If you don't get pregnant quickly, or worse, if you miscarry, your popularity will nosedive. People will blame your body, your foreign blood, your sins, your lack of piety. Never mind that medieval medicine was basically guesswork with leeches. Never mind that men also contribute half of that equation. You are the queen, and therefore the breeding machine. The pressure is constant and deafening. There's a long-standing scholarly debate about how much say medieval queens had over their own marital beds. Some argue that queens could negotiate bedroom dynamics, especially if they were politically savvy or came from powerful families. Others believe queens were largely powerless, their consent a non-issue in legal and religious eyes. What we do know is that many queens found clever ways to control what they could: timing, influence over household staff, and eventually guidance over their children's futures. But at this stage, you're mostly along for the ride, so you do what you must. You perfect your smile. You begin keeping a private journal, perhaps, or whispering thoughts into the ears of trusted maids, though trust is always relative. You go to mass. You attend court. You send letters to your mother back home if the scribes allow it. You start planning for what comes next, not just pregnancy, but survival. And survival, you're starting to realize, means more than staying alive. It means staying useful, charming, obedient, fertile, unthreatening, but also clever, resilient, patient. You're walking a tightrope wrapped in gold thread, and every. Morning, as the bells toll across the grey courtyard and your reflection flickers in a polished copper mirror, you ask yourself quietly, how long can I keep this up? It starts with a flutter, just a whisper of nausea when you rise, a slight tightening in your chest when the morning porridge hits your stomach the wrong way. Your maid notices before you do, narrowing her eyes as she helps lace your gown a little looser. The word spreads faster than you'd think. The queen is changing. Couriers exchange looks. The cook starts preparing lighter foods. A physician is summoned without you even asking. No one says the word directly, not yet, but you already know what they're hoping for. You're pregnant. Maybe. And just like that, you're not just a wife anymore. You're the womb of the realm. You've gone from ornamental to essential. The queen's job, your job, is finally happening. And while on the surface there's joy, gifts, blessings, and ceremonial prayers, underneath it all is the sound of chairs being pulled closer to the throne. Because once you're carrying an heir, your power shifts just a little, but enough for people to start calculating how long they'll have to wait for a new king, or if you're really lucky, a queen mother. Pregnancy in medieval times is terrifying. There are no ultrasounds, no prenatal vitamins, no real understanding of germs or what a uterus actually looks like. You're not so much cared for as you are monitored, watched like a relic on the verge of cracking. The royal physicians poke and prod, feeling your pulse, measuring your belly with ribbons, muttering things in Latin while your ladies-in-waiting line up cloths soaked in lavender and rosemary. Some of the herbs help, some probably don't, some, if the dose is wrong, might even kill you. And yet, you go through the motions, trying to appear serene. You attend Mass every morning, nodding piously while the priest talks about the Virgin Mary and the miracle of life. That's the image they want from you. Holy Mother, chosen vessel, serene goddess of impending motherhood. But inside, you're a 17-year-old girl with lower back pain, a constant headache, and zero control over what's happening to your body. Every kick from inside your belly is both thrilling and terrifying. If it's a boy, you win the game. If it's a girl, you smile politely and pretend everyone's not secretly disappointed. And if the child is stillborn or you die in labour, well, then you'll be remembered in ballads as a tragic heroine, which is cold comfort, to be honest. By your 7th month, the palace begins to quiet down. Your husband grows more cautious. Visitors are shushed. Loud noises are forbidden near your chambers. The court is holding its collective breath. Midwives are brought in from far and wide, some traditional, some trained by monks, all quietly panicking beneath their calm smiles, because childbirth in the Middle Ages is a gamble with weighted dice. Even queens die screaming in childbed, probably especially queens. The pressure is higher, the gossip sharper, the risks enormous. And when the labour finally begins, the world shrinks. You're taken to a darkened room, windows covered, icons of saints propped up all around you. Candles flicker along the walls, shadows dancing like anxious angels. The room becomes what they call a lying-in chamber, sealed against bad spirits. It's hot, crowded, and thick with the smell of burning herbs and fear. You scream, of course you do. There's no pain relief, just grit and groan and chant and pray. The women around you, your ladies, the midwives, maybe even a few noble women, offer comfort, or at least try to. Some hold your hands, one might whisper a prayer in your ear over and over like a lullaby. But you're alone in this, really. Completely, utterly alone in your pain. Hours pass, maybe days. You lose track. The world becomes a blur of heat and agony and tightening pressure. You scream until your voice breaks. You pass out and come to. You think you hear someone say, "It's crowning," but it could just as easily be the last prayer you'll ever hear. And then, if you're lucky, a cry, a new voice, raw and angry, slicing through the candle smoke. A midwife lifts the child high, announces the sex with trembling reverence. "A boy," she says, or maybe a girl. And the court outside erupts accordingly. You don't even see the baby at first. Oh, you're too exhausted, too bloody, too shattered to sit up. Then someone presses the infant into your arms eventually, and for a second, a fleeting, golden, hallowed second, you feel joy. Pure, unfiltered joy. It's yours. This tiny, squirming person is yours. And then you remember, he doesn't really belong to you. He belongs to the kingdom. If it's a son, he's the heir, and your value skyrockets overnight. You're no longer just the queen, you're the mother of the future, a living insurance policy against succession wars. Your rooms fill with gifts, your name is sung in churches, and suddenly everyone wants your opinion on nursery arrangements, on treaties, on what colour robe the baby should wear for his first court appearance. If it's a girl, the congratulations are still there, but lighter, softer. A courtier might mention how daughters make wonderful bargaining chips for future marriages. Another might remind you that queens bear many children, and there's always next time. The fringe truth. Sometimes, if the queen gave birth to a boy, coins were minted within hours. Tiny, hastily stamped medallions that said, "This realm has an heir. All is well." If you gave birth to a girl, well, no coins. Maybe a feast if you were lucky. And here comes the scholarly debate. Did childbirth increase a queen's political power or trap her further? Some argue that motherhood granted queen's influence, control over the royal nursery, a seat at the regency table if the king died. Others point out that it made queens more vulnerable, exposed to dangerous childbirths over and over again, reduced to walking cradles whose usefulness hinged on the health of their offspring. The answer, as always, depends on who you were, where you ruled, and how lucky your body was. You're bundled up in clean linen now, propped on pillows, your skin still pale and waxy, but the baby is breathing. You're breathing. The bells are ringing across the city, the kingdom rejoices. And you close your eyes and try to forget that this is only the first round. You've survived childbirth. That alone makes you something of a miracle. Now, as the days blend into a haze of damp linen, soft lullabies and sharp pelvic pain, you begin to settle into your new role. Not just as queen, not just as wife, but as something far more exhausting. Royal Mother. And with that title comes another shift, one that has less to do with survival and more to do with presentation. You can barely sit upright, but already the court expects you to begin looking the part again. And looking the part, as it turns out, is a full-time job. Your wardrobe becomes a stage, and every layer you put on is political. Every colour, every hem, every jewel carries a message. I am regal. I am fertile. I am strong. But more than anything else, it screams, I am worth obeying. You're no longer dressing to impress a husband. You're dressing to remind the kingdom that you belong here. That you have produced proof of your power in the form of a living, breathing heir. You're not to be dismissed, ignored, or replaced. Not yet, anyway. In the royal wardrobe, there's no such thing as casual. There's only layers: chemise, surcoat, gown, overgown, cloak, silk, velvet, fur, embroidery so fine it looks like lace, stitched with real gold thread, jewels sewn directly into sleeves. You don't wear your wealth, you drag it behind you, sewn into the hem and clinging to your wrists. Your crown alone could buy a small town and still have change, left over for a cathedral bell, and yet, underneath it all, you itch. The brocade is stiff, the pearls rub your collarbone raw. Some of the fur lining smells like damp cellar, especially in winter when nothing dries properly. You long for soft linen shifts for bare feet on warm stones, for a moment without corsetry and pins. But queens don't get comfort, they get presents. Now, here's the tricky bit. You don't actually choose your wardrobe, not entirely. A royal tailor does that, so does your chamberlain. And sometimes, just for fun, your mother-in-law weighs in. Your body is essentially on loan to the crown, and so is the fabric that wraps it. If a foreign ambassador visits, they'll expect you to wear a particular colour, perhaps blue to signify purity, or red to evoke power. If it's Easter, your garments will be stitched with lilies and crosses. If it's Advent, out comes the dark velvet and silver thread. Every season is a costume change. Historical tidbit: Queen Isabella of Castile's wardrobe accounts were meticulously kept, detailing every gown, every fur trim, every jewel. These records show how deeply intertwined royal fashion was with political messaging and national identity. So, as you stand there, weighted down by layers of silk and expectation, you understand that your appearance is a language in itself. It speaks of power, of tradition, of the continuation of a dynasty. And you, the young woman underneath it all, are merely the messenger. What do you think was the most challenging aspect of being a medieval queen? Hello, and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers, letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honoured to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart, or just a few time zones away, both listening as the stars come out? If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. The medieval mind approached law differently than we do today. Where we seek consistency and precedent, they often relied on tradition, divine judgment, and what we might charitably call creative problem-solving. Laws were not merely rules to be followed, but reflections of deeply held beliefs about morality, social order, and the very nature of truth itself. Consider the peculiar case of animal trials, a legal tradition that flourished across medieval Europe for several centuries. Yes, you heard correctly. Animals could be put on trial, complete with legal representation, formal proceedings, and even appeals. In 1386, a pig in Fête, France was tried and executed for killing an infant. The pig was dressed in human clothing for the execution, as if to emphasize its moral culpability. This was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader legal framework that held animals accountable for their actions, in ways that seem almost fantastical to us now. These animal trials were not mere curiosities, but reflected deep-seated beliefs about justice and moral order. Medieval people believed that all of creation was bound by divine law, and when that law was broken, even by a beast, justice demanded satisfaction. Pigs that killed children, bulls that gored farmers, and even insects that destroyed crops could find themselves defendants in formal legal proceedings. The legal representation provided to these animal defendants was often surprisingly thorough. In 1750, a female donkey was tried for bestiality alongside her human accomplice in France. The donkey's defense attorney argued successfully that she had been an unwilling participant, and she was acquitted, while the man was executed. Witnesses even testified to the donkey's good character and previous virtuous behaviour. But animals were not the only unexpected defendants in medieval courts. Inanimate objects too could find themselves on trial. If a sword killed someone, the weapon itself might be tried and banished from the realm. Bells that had rung during violent storms were sometimes put on trial for their role in summoning destructive weather. Trees that had fallen and killed passers-by could be formally prosecuted and sentenced to be cut down and removed. These object trials reflected a worldview where the boundaries between the animate and inanimate, the moral and immoral, were far more fluid than our modern understanding would suggest. Every element of creation was seen as part of a grand moral order, and when that order was disrupted, the law stepped in to restore balance. The concept of trial by ordeal added another layer of strangeness to medieval justice. These were legal procedures designed to determine guilt or innocence through divine intervention. The underlying belief was that God would not allow an innocent person to suffer harm during these tests, making them a form of supernatural lie detector. Trial by hot iron was one such ordeal. The accused would be required to carry a piece of red-hot iron for a specified distance, usually 9 paces. Their hand would then be bandaged and examined after 3 days. If the wound was healing cleanly, they were declared innocent. If it showed signs of infection or poor healing, guilt was assumed. Trial by cold water involved throwing the accused into a body of water while bound. If they floated, they were considered guilty, as the pure water was rejecting them. If they sank and drowned, they were posthumously declared innocent. This presented what we might call a significant design flaw in the justice system, as innocence could only be proven through death. Perhaps most dramatically, trial by combat allowed disputes to be settled through physical battle. This could involve the actual disputants fighting each other, or they could hire champions to fight on their behalf. The belief was that God would ensure victory for the righteous party. Interestingly, this practice was not limited to men. Women, clergy, and the elderly could all demand trial by combat, though they typically employed champions rather than fighting personally. The legal status of various professions in medieval Europe also produced some wonderfully strange laws. Executioners, for instance, occupied a peculiar position in society. While their services were essential for the functioning of the justice system, they were often considered ritually unclean and were subjected to numerous restrictions. In many German states, executioners were required to live outside town walls and could only enter the town to perform their duties. They were forbidden from touching food in markets, as their touch was believed to contaminate goods. Interestingly, executioners often supplemented their income by working as healers and veterinarians. Their intimate knowledge of anatomy, gained through their primary profession, made them surprisingly effective medical practitioners. This created the paradoxical situation where the same person might take a life in the morning and save one in the afternoon. The legal treatment of debt in medieval Europe produced some particularly inventive solutions. In parts of medieval France, a debtor who could not pay might be required to sit naked in the town square while crying out their shame to all who passed. This public humiliation was designed both as punishment and as a way to encourage charitable contributions from passers-by. Some regions developed the concept of debt inheritance in ways that seem almost surreal today. In certain parts of medieval Germany, unpaid debts could be inherited by the debtor's children, but only if they had been present when the debt was incurred. This led to the strange practice of excluding children from important financial discussions to protect them from future liability. The regulation of markets and trade produced its own category of unusual laws. In medieval London, the punishment for selling bad food was often poetic justice taken to extremes. Bakers who sold underweight bread might be dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf hung around their necks. Brewers who watered down their ale could be forced to drink only their own inferior product for a specified period. The medieval understanding of property rights also led to some fascinating legal concepts. The doctrine of treasure trove held that any valuable object found buried in the ground belonged to the crown, based on the assumption that it had been hidden with the intention of retrieval. However, if the treasure was found above ground, it belonged to the finder, leading to complex legal debates about exactly what constituted buried versus merely hidden. These strange laws were not merely the products of backward thinking or primitive legal understanding. They reflected sophisticated attempts to maintain social order in a world very different from our own. Medieval society faced challenges we can barely imagine: constant warfare, devastating plagues, economic uncertainty, and the ever-present threat of famine. In such a world, laws needed to be more than mere rules. They needed to be mechanisms for preserving the delicate balance that kept communities together. The apparent strangeness of these laws often dissolves when we understand the context in which they operated. What seems bizarre to us made perfect sense to people living in a world where divine judgment was a daily reality, where community harmony was essential for survival, and where justice needed to be both seen and felt by all members of society. As we drift deeper into the medieval world, we begin to see that these strange laws were threads in a complex tapestry of belief, tradition, and practical necessity. They tell us not just about legal systems, but about entire ways of understanding the world, human nature, and our place in the grand scheme of creation. In our next exploration, we will delve deeper into the curious world of medieval marriage laws, where love, politics, and legal ingenuity combine to create some of the most fascinating and bewildering regulations in European history. But for now, let the strange and wonderful world of medieval justice settle gently in your mind as you drift toward peaceful sleep. The medieval world was one of stark contrasts when it came to food. While kings and nobles feasted on elaborate banquets with exotic spices and multiple courses, the vast majority of people lived on the edge of starvation, their meals consisting of little more than coarse bread and thin gruel. This disparity wasn't merely about wealth, it was a reflection of an entire social system built on inequality. For the common peasant, meat was an extraordinary luxury. A family might keep a pig or a few chickens, but these animals were far too valuable to slaughter regularly. Instead, they provided eggs, milk, and the occasional offspring that could be sold for much-needed coin. When meat did appear on the peasant table, it was usually during religious festivals or when an animal was too old or sick to serve any other purpose. Even then, every scrap was used, from organ meats to blood puddings, as nothing could be wasted in a world where the next meal was never guaranteed. The preservation of food presented another monumental challenge. Without refrigeration, medieval people had to rely on salting, smoking, drying, and fermentation to keep their food from spoiling. Salt itself was expensive and often of poor quality, filled with impurities that could make preserved meats taste terrible or even cause illness. Fish were packed in barrels with heavy salt, creating a product that bore little resemblance to fresh seafood. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented into sauerkraut, while fruits were dried into leathery strips that could last through the winter months. But perhaps the most insidious problem was the widespread adulteration of food. Unscrupulous merchants and bakers, driven by poverty and desperation, regularly cut corners to maximize their profits. Bread, the staple of the medieval diet, was often stretched with sawdust, chalk, ground acorns, or even bone meal. These additives not only made the bread less nutritious, but could also be dangerous to consume. Similarly, ale and wine were frequently watered down, leaving consumers with weak, unpalatable drinks that provided little refreshment or nutrition. The story of Agnes, a fictional but representative alewife, illustrates these challenges perfectly. Struggling to support her family after her husband's death, Agnes found herself faced with rising grain prices and dwindling customers. Desperate to make her ale last longer and increase her profits, she began watering down her brew. At first, the deception went unnoticed, but word soon spread about the weak, tasteless ale. Her once loyal customers began seeking other establishments, and Agnes's reputation was ruined. Eventually, she was forced to close her business, leaving her family in even more desperate circumstances. The authorities did attempt to regulate food quality through laws like the assize of bread and ale, which set standards for weight, price, and quality. Violators could face fines, public humiliation in the pillory, or even corporal punishment. In some cases, dishonest bakers were dragged through the streets with their substandard loaves hung around their necks as a warning to others. However, enforcement was inconsistent and often ineffective, as the underlying economic pressures that drove people to adulterate their products remained unchanged. The lack of variety in the medieval diet was another source of suffering. While we today can enjoy fruits and vegetables from around the world year-round, medieval people were entirely dependent on what could be grown locally and what was in season. For most of the year, peasants subsisted on a monotonous diet of porridge made from barley, oats or rye, accompanied by whatever vegetables they could grow in their small garden plots. Onions, leeks and cabbages were among the hardiest crops, but these provided little in the way of essential vitamins and minerals. The seasonal nature of food availability meant that late winter and early spring were particularly difficult times. By then, the previous year's harvest would be running low, and the new crops had not yet matured. This period, known as the hunger gap, was when malnutrition was most severe and death rates highest. Children born during these lean months often suffered from stunted growth and weakened immune systems that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Spices, which we now take for granted, were among the most precious commodities in medieval Europe. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves and nutmeg had to be transported over vast distances along dangerous trade routes, making them extraordinarily expensive. A pound of nutmeg in the 11th century could cost as much as 7 oxen, putting it far beyond the reach of ordinary people. For the wealthy, spices were not just flavouring agents, but symbols of status and power, displayed as prominently as jewels or fine clothing. The contrast between rich and poor was perhaps nowhere more evident than in the royal feast. These elaborate affairs were designed not just to feed the nobility, but to demonstrate their wealth and power. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted peacocks, swans and other exotic birds, their feathers carefully replaced after cooking to create stunning visual displays. Sugar sculptures called subtleties depicted scenes from mythology or heraldic symbols, while servants paraded dishes through the hall with great ceremony. Yet even these magnificent feasts came with their own dangers. Without understanding of food safety, even the wealthy were vulnerable to food poisoning and other ailments. The death of King John of England in 1216, attributed to consuming spoiled peaches, serves as a reminder that in the medieval world every meal was potentially hazardous. The king had been travelling through the countryside when he stopped at an abbey and indulged in what he thought was a harmless treat. Within days he was dead from what modern historians believe was severe food poisoning. The unsanitary conditions of medieval life compounded these food safety issues. Peasant families often shared their single-room dwellings with their livestock, as the animals provided warmth during the cold winter months. However, this arrangement meant that animal waste, insects, and vermin were constant presences in the home. Food was prepared and consumed in these same spaces, with contamination almost inevitable. In medieval cities, the situation was even worse. Narrow winding streets were filled with garbage, human waste, and the refuse from various trades and industries. The lack of proper sewage systems meant that waste often contaminated water sources, making even drinking water dangerous. The Thames in London, for example, served simultaneously as the city's primary water source and its main sewer, a situation that contributed to frequent outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases. The Catholic Church added another layer of complexity to medieval food culture through its extensive fasting requirements. During Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, the faithful were expected to abstain from meat, dairy products, and eggs. For the wealthy, this meant substituting fish and other alternatives, but for the poor, it often meant simply going without. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were also designated as meatless days throughout the year, further restricting an already limited diet. While the Church's intentions may have been spiritual, the practical effect of these restrictions was often to worsen the nutritional status of people who were already malnourished. The story of John and Matilda, a fictional peasant couple, illustrates this dilemma. With 3 children to feed and only a small plot of land, they struggled to provide adequate nutrition even in the best of times. During Lent, they were expected to give up the small amounts of preserved meat and dairy that provided crucial protein and calories. As the days wore on, their children grew weak and listless, crying constantly from hunger. John, a devout man, wrestled with his faith as he watched his family suffer, while Matilda secretly dreamed of the hearty stew she would make when the fast finally ended. Not all of the Church's influence on food was negative, however. Monasteries and abbeys, with their extensive land holdings and well-organized communities, often served as centers of agricultural innovation. Monks pioneered new techniques in crop rotation, irrigation, and animal husbandry that gradually improved food production. They also served as sources of charity, distributing bread and ale to the hungry, and providing shelter for travellers and pilgrims. The story of St. Hildegard of Bingen exemplifies the positive aspects of the Church's relationship with food. Born into a noble family in 12th century Germany, Hildegard became an abbess and was renowned for her knowledge of herbal medicine and nutrition. She wrote extensively about the properties of different grains and foods, advocating for spelt as a healthier alternative to common wheat. Under her guidance, the nuns at her abbey produced high-quality bread that was distributed to the sick and poor in the surrounding community. Hildegard's holistic approach to nutrition, which emphasized the connection between food and health, was remarkably prescient and would not be fully appreciated until modern times. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 represents perhaps the darkest chapter in medieval food history. A catastrophic combination of climate change, crop failures, and political instability plunged much of Europe into 7 years of starvation and misery. Contemporary chronicles paint a horrifying picture of the suffering endured by ordinary people. The Flemish chronicler William of Nangis wrote that men ate dogs, horses, cats, and other unclean things, while other accounts describe people resorting to cannibalism in their desperation. The famine hit different regions with varying severity, but nowhere was spared entirely. In some areas of the Low Countries and Scandinavia, mortality rates reached 10 to 25% of the population. The German city of Erfurt saw an average of 16 deaths per day during the worst years, compared to just 2 per day in normal times. The psychological impact of the famine was as devastating as the physical toll, creating a generation scarred by the memory of extreme hunger and loss. Even in normal times, the threat of food scarcity was never far away. A single failed harvest could spell disaster for entire communities, and peasant families lived in constant fear of the next crisis. This precarious existence shaped every aspect of medieval life, from marriage and family planning to religious beliefs and social structures. People developed elaborate strategies for coping with scarcity, from complex systems of mutual aid to detailed knowledge of wild plants and alternative food sources. The contrast between medieval food culture and our modern abundance is striking. Today we can walk into a supermarket and find fruits from South America, spices from Asia, and vegetables from around the world, all neatly packaged and ready to eat. We have access to a variety of foods that would have been unimaginable to even the wealthiest medieval nobles. Our understanding of nutrition, food safety and preservation has transformed eating from a daily struggle into a source of pleasure and nourishment. Yet this abundance comes with its own challenges. We grapple with issues of food waste, environmental sustainability, and diet-related health problems that were unknown in the medieval world. The global food system that provides us with such variety also creates new forms of inequality and environmental degradation. Perhaps there are lessons to be learned from our medieval ancestors about the value of local seasonal eating and the importance of not taking food for granted. The story of medieval food is ultimately a story of human resilience and ingenuity in the face of enormous challenges. Despite the constant threats of hunger, disease, and adulteration, people found ways to survive and even create moments of joy and celebration around food. They developed preservation techniques that are still used today, created dishes that evolved into modern cuisines, and established traditions of hospitality and sharing that continue to shape our culture. As we reflect on this distant past, we gain a deeper appreciation for the progress we have made and the privileges we enjoy. The simple act of opening a refrigerator or visiting a grocery store represents centuries of advancement in agriculture, technology, and social organization. At the same time, the medieval experience reminds us of our fundamental dependence on food and the importance of ensuring that everyone has access to adequate nutrition. The legacy of medieval food culture lives on in many ways. Traditional preservation methods like smoking and fermentation have experienced a renaissance among modern cooks seeking authentic flavors and sustainable practices. The seasonal rhythms that once dictated medieval diets are being rediscovered by those promoting local and sustainable agriculture. Even the elaborate feasts of the nobility have their modern counterparts in the fine dining establishments that turn meals into theatrical experiences. Perhaps, most importantly, The medieval experience teaches us about the deep connections between food, community, and survival. In a world where hunger was a constant threat, sharing food became one of the most fundamental expressions of human compassion and solidarity. The communal meals that marked religious festivals and life transitions were not just celebrations, but affirmations of social bonds and mutual support. As we drift off to sleep in our modern world of abundance, we can remember the countless generations who struggled to fill their bellies with whatever meagre sustenance they could find. Their perseverance in the face of such hardship reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of gratitude for the simple blessings we often take for granted. In honouring their memory, we commit ourselves to building a world where no one needs suffer the pangs of hunger that defines so much of human history. As the candle-lit shadows danced across the stone walls of medieval castles, a stark culinary divide defined the era. While nobles feasted on exotic delicacies and sumptuous banquets, the vast majority of medieval Europeans faced a daily struggle for sustenance that would horrify modern sensibilities. The scarcity of spices created one of the most glaring differences between rich and poor. While a pound of nutmeg in the 11th century cost as much as 7 fattened oxen, peasants made do with whatever meagre seasonings they could find. Garlic, mustard, and vinegar became their primary weapons against the relentless blandness of their daily fare. The absence of reliable preservation methods meant fresh produce remained seasonal luxuries, leaving most to subsist on monotonous grains and whatever hardy vegetables could survive the harsh climate. Meat consumption revealed perhaps the starkest inequality. A prosperous peasant family might slaughter their pig only once a year, usually at Christmas, while nobles gorged themselves on elaborate dishes featuring exotic game. When meat did grace the peasant table, it often came in forms that would turn modern stomachs: organ meats, blood puddings, and cuts from animals too old or sick for other purposes. Fish offered some relief for those near water sources, but even this was typically preserved through heavy salting, creating a far cry from the delicate preparations we know today. The Church's influence permeated every aspect of medieval food culture, often compounding the hardships faced by the poor. Lent's 40-day fast meant giving up what little meat and dairy peasants possessed, while wealthy nobles could afford exotic substitutes. The story of Agnes Paston, brought before a manorial court in 1322 for stealing bread during Lent to feed her starving children, illustrates the cruel irony of religious dietary restrictions imposed on those already living at the edge of starvation. Food adulteration ran rampant in an era without regulations or quality control. Unscrupulous bakers stretched their precious flour with sawdust, chalk, or ground acorns, creating dense, gritty loaves that provided little nutrition. Alewives watered down their brews to increase profits, leaving customers with weak, unsatisfying drinks that barely qualified as beverages. The assize of bread and ale attempted to regulate these practices, but enforcement remained sporadic at best. Unsanitary conditions made every meal a potential hazard. Peasant families shared their cramped quarters with livestock, creating breeding grounds for disease and contamination. Animal waste mingled with food preparation areas, while flies and vermin spread filth throughout living spaces. Even kings weren't immune. King John of England's death in 1216, attributed to consuming spoiled peaches, demonstrated that contaminated food could fell rulers as easily as peasants. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 revealed the precarious nature of medieval food security. 7 years of crop failures plunged Europe into starvation so severe that chroniclers reported cannibalism and people eating grass, bark, and even their own children. Mortality rates reached 25% in some regions, with cities like Erfurt averaging 16 deaths per day compared to 2 in normal times. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval people demonstrated remarkable resilience and ingenuity. They developed sophisticated preservation techniques through salting, smoking, and fermentation. Women who bore primary responsibility for feeding their families created folk traditions of pickling and foraging that sustained communities through lean times. Monasteries served as centres of agricultural innovation and charitable food distribution, offering some relief to the desperate. The rare medieval feast provided a stunning contrast to daily reality. Royal banquets featured dozens of elaborate dishes, roasted peacocks, sugar sculptures, and delicacies flavoured with precious spices. These displays of culinary opulence served not just as entertainment, but as powerful demonstrations of wealth and status, reminding all present of the vast gulf between the privileged few and the struggling masses. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval people found ways to create meaning and community around food despite its scarcity. Harvest festivals brought villagers together in celebration of successful crops. Wedding feasts, however modest, marked life's milestones with shared meals. Even the humblest pottage became an opportunity for families to gather around the hearth, telling stories and maintaining bonds that sustained them through hardship. The legacy of medieval food culture reminds us of both human vulnerability and resilience. In an age where we can access flavors from around the globe with unprecedented ease and safety, it's worth remembering those who found joy and sustenance in the simplest of meals. Their struggles and ingenuity laid the foundations for the abundance we now enjoy, teaching us never to take for granted the basic human right to nourishment and the profound satisfaction of sharing food with those we love. As we drift off to sleep with full bellies and endless choices at our fingertips, we can honor their memory by appreciating the remarkable journey that brought us from medieval scarcity to modern plenty. In every bite we take, we taste the hard-won progress of countless generations who transformed necessity into the art of cuisine, ensuring that future generations might know abundance where they knew only want. Looking at your reference videos and existing script, I'll continue from where Part 3 left off, maintaining the sleep-inducing tone while exploring the harsh realities of medieval European law and society. As we've seen, the world of medieval Europe was one where even the most basic human needs were fraught with difficulty and danger. Food was scarce, often contaminated, and subject to the whims of weather and war. But perhaps even more challenging than securing one's next meal was navigating the complex and often brutal system of justice that governed daily life. The laws of medieval Europe were a patchwork of traditions, customs, and edicts that varied dramatically from one region to another, creating a landscape where justice was anything but certain. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval courthouse, imagine the tension as an accused thief stands before a panel of judges. The evidence against him is circumstantial at best, yet the consequences of a guilty verdict could mean the loss of a hand, an eye, or even his life. This was not a world of careful deliberation and reasoned argument, but one where justice was swift, harsh, and often arbitrary. The legal systems that governed medieval Europe were designed not so much to determine guilt or innocence, but to maintain order through fear, and to reinforce the rigid social hierarchies that kept peasants in their place and nobles in power. The foundation of medieval law rested upon a complex web of feudal obligations and customary practices that had evolved over centuries. At the heart of this system was the concept of personal loyalty and mutual obligation between lord and vassal. A peasant owed service to his lord not merely as a tenant, but as a bound serf, whose very existence was tied to the land he worked. In return, the lord was expected to provide protection and justice, though these protections were often more theoretical than real. The lord's court was typically held in the great hall of his manor, where he would sit in judgment over disputes between his tenants, crimes committed within his domain, and violations of the countless regulations that governed peasant life. These manorial courts dealt with a bewildering array of offences, from the trivial to the serious. A peasant might find himself hauled before his lord for allowing his pigs to wander into a neighbour's garden, for failing to attend the required number of days of labour service, or for the serious crime of attempting to leave the manor without permission. The punishments were often brutal and disproportionate to the crimes. A serf caught trying to flee might be branded on the forehead with a hot iron, marking him forever as a runaway. A woman accused of adultery might be forced to walk naked through the village while being pelted with stones and filth by her neighbours. The concept of individual rights as we understand them today was virtually non-existent in medieval legal thinking. Justice was not about protecting the innocent or ensuring fair treatment, but about maintaining social order and reinforcing the authority of those in power. The idea that all people might be equal before the law would have been laughable to a medieval lord who saw himself as inherently superior to the peasants who worked his land. The law existed to serve the interests of the ruling class, and any benefits that might trickle down to the common people were incidental at best. Perhaps nowhere was this inequality more apparent than in the realm of criminal justice. When a crime was committed, the response of the authorities depended heavily on the social status of both the perpetrator and the victim. If a peasant stole a loaf of bread from a nobleman's table, he might face hanging or mutilation, but if a nobleman killed a peasant in a fit of rage, he might escape with nothing more than a fine or a token punishment, a stark reminder of the harsh realities of medieval power. As we conclude this journey into the peculiar world of medieval law and daily life, consider how different our modern understanding of justice truly is. We strive for equality before the law, for due process, and for punishments that fit the crime. The medieval period, with its animal trials, ordeals, and stark social divisions, offers a stark contrast, a world where the lines between animate and inanimate, crime and misfortune, were blurred by a blend of deeply held beliefs and the raw realities of power. Hello, and welcome to a quiet journey back in time. Tonight, we'll open a door to a world once lost, now rediscovered through the art of storytelling. Perhaps you're cozy in bed, or simply letting the day's last hours drift by. Either way, I'm honoured to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Are we continents apart, or just a few time zones away, listening as the stars emerge? If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. Medieval castles were built with one brutal truth in mind: to make entry lethal for any unwanted guest. Every stone, every passage, every room was crafted to funnel attackers into meticulously planned traps, leading them to their doom. But the horrifying truth is these death traps weren't just for enemy soldiers, they were equally deadly to those who called them home. The medieval world was a place where death lurked everywhere, and nowhere was this clearer than within a castle's supposedly safe walls. From the moment you crossed the threshold, you entered a realm where a single misstep could send you plummeting to your death, where disease festered in damp corridors, and where the very air you breathed could carry the seeds of your destruction. Over the next few episodes, we'll explore the 12 most deadly aspects of medieval castle life. We'll uncover how grand entrance halls became elaborate killing fields, how spiral staircases turned into death traps for both defenders and attackers, and how primitive sanitation systems transformed these mighty fortresses into breeding grounds for mankind's deadliest diseases. But before we dive into the specific ways death stalked these stone fortresses, we need to understand the world that built them. The medieval period, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th centuries, was an era of almost constant warfare, political instability, and technological limits that made daily survival a monumental challenge. In this violent world, castles emerged as the ultimate expression of military architecture. They weren't built for comfort or convenience, they were built to kill. Every feature, from window placement to doorway width, was calculated to maximize defensive advantage and create as many opportunities as possible to eliminate intruders. The first thing that strikes you when approaching a medieval castle is its deliberate intimidation. These structures were designed to project power and inspire fear even from a distance. The massive walls, often 20 feet thick or more, weren't just defensive barriers. They were psychological weapons meant to demoralize attackers before they even reached the gates. Take Caerphilly Castle in Wales, for example. Built in the 13th century, this fortress covers over 30 acres and is surrounded by an elaborate system of water defences. The castle appears to rise directly from the lake itself, creating an almost supernatural impression of impregnable strength. This visual impact was entirely intentional. Medieval architects knew that the fear generated by their castle's appearance was often their first and most effective line of defence. But the psychological warfare began long before you reached the castle walls. The approach to any well-designed medieval fortress was a carefully choreographed journey through increasingly dangerous terrain. Roads leading to castles were deliberately built to force visitors into vulnerable positions, winding through marshes, along narrow causeways, or up steep hillsides where defenders could rain down death from above. The outer defences of a castle were designed as a series of concentric death traps, each more sophisticated than the last. Beyond the main walls lay the outer ward, a deceptively open space that was actually a carefully prepared killing ground. Here, attackers would find themselves trapped between the outer palisade and the main castle walls, exposed to crossfire from multiple directions with no cover and no escape route. Medieval engineers were masters of what we might now call psychological manipulation through architecture. They understood that fear and confusion were their greatest allies in defending a castle. The layout of these fortresses was deliberately maze-like, designed to disorient and separate attacking forces, while channeling them into predetermined killing zones. Consider the entrance to a typical 13th century castle. You might think the main gate would be the most heavily fortified point, and you'd be correct, but not in the way you might expect. The gatehouse wasn't just a barrier to keep people out. It was an elaborate trap designed to capture and methodically eliminate anyone who managed to breach the outer defences. A standard castle gatehouse was a complex multi-storey structure that could house dozens of defenders. These weren't simple doorways with heavy doors. They were sophisticated military installations equipped with multiple layers of defensive systems. A typical gatehouse might feature a drawbridge over a water-filled moat, followed by a portcullis, a heavy iron grating that could be dropped to trap attackers. Then another drawbridge over a dry moat or pit, followed by massive wooden doors reinforced with iron, and finally another portcullis. But the true genius of castle defence lay not just in these obvious barriers, but in the killing zones created between them. Imagine you're part of an attacking force that has somehow managed to lower the first drawbridge and raise the first portcullis. You rush forward into what appears to be the entrance passage, only to find yourself trapped in a narrow corridor with walls rising 30 feet on either side. Above you, defenders peer down through murder holes, openings in the ceiling through which they could drop boiling oil, molten lead, or simply large stones onto your head. The term murder hole isn't some dramatic modern invention. It's a translation of the medieval French meurtrière, which literally means place of murder. These openings were strategically positioned throughout castle gatehouses and corridors, creating overlapping fields of fire that made it virtually impossible for attackers to advance without suffering catastrophic casualties. Medieval castle designers had studied the art of killing with the same dedication that modern engineers study aerodynamics or structural integrity. They understood that the key to effective defense wasn't just building thick walls. It was creating situations where attackers would be forced into positions where they could be eliminated systematically and efficiently. The barbican, an outer gatehouse structure that became common in the 13th and 14th centuries, represents perhaps the pinnacle of this philosophy. A barbican was essentially a fortified funnel that forced attackers to approach the main gate along a predetermined path, while being subjected to constant fire from multiple directions. The walls of a barbican were built at angles that eliminated any possibility of finding cover, while the narrow passages ensured that attacking forces would be compressed into dense formations that made them perfect targets for medieval artillery. One of the most sophisticated examples of barbican design can be found at Warwick Castle, where the approach to the main gate forces attackers to make a series of turns while being overlooked by no fewer than 6 separate defensive positions. Each turn in the path was designed to present attackers with a new threat, while preventing them from seeing what lay ahead. This wasn't just military architecture, it was psychological warfare expressed in stone and mortar. The designers of these fortresses understood that an enemy's imagination could be just as effective a weapon as any sword or crossbow. By creating approaches that were clearly dangerous but whose specific threats remained hidden, they forced attackers to confront not just physical obstacles, but the constant fear of unknown perils waiting around each corner. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval castle design was how these death traps affected the people who actually lived within the walls. While much attention has been paid to how castles defended against external threats, the daily reality of life inside these fortresses was often just as deadly as any siege. The same architectural features that made castles effective military installations also made them incredibly dangerous places to live. The narrow, winding staircases that confused attackers also made it easy for residents to take fatal falls, especially in the dark corridors lit only by flickering torches. The thick walls that provided protection from enemy artillery also created a damp, poorly ventilated environment that was perfect for the spread of disease. Medieval record-keeping, while not always comprehensive, offers glimpses of just how deadly castle life could be for its inhabitants. Chronicles from the 13th and 14th centuries are filled with accounts of nobles and servants who met their deaths through accidents directly related to their home's defensive features. Take the tragic case of William de Braose, a powerful Norman lord who fell to his death from the walls of his own castle in 1230. According to contemporary accounts, William was inspecting the defences of Bramber Castle in Sussex when he slipped on the narrow wall and plummeted 40 feet to the courtyard below. The same battlement designed to provide a secure firing position for archers became a death trap for the castle's own lord. Such accidents were far from rare. The defensive architecture that made castles formidable military installations also created countless opportunities for fatal mishaps. Spiral staircases designed to favour right-handed defenders fighting their way down were treacherous for anyone carrying loads or moving quickly in poor light. The narrow arrow loops that provided protected firing positions also created dangerous protrusions that could catch clothing or cause people to lose their balance. Perhaps most deadly of all were the castle sanitation systems, or rather, the lack thereof. Medieval castles were essentially self-contained cities that might house hundreds or even thousands of people during sieges. The waste produced by this population had to go somewhere, and the solutions devised by medieval engineers, while ingenious for their time, created perfect conditions for the spread of deadly diseases. The typical castle latrine, known as a garderobe, was built into the thickness of the castle walls and discharged directly into the moat or onto the ground outside the walls. While this system had the advantage of being simple and requiring no maintenance, it also meant that the castle's water supply was constantly being contaminated by human waste. During sieges, when the castle population swelled and water sources became limited, these conditions became breeding grounds for cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, found perfect conditions for transmission within castle walls. The crowded, poorly ventilated conditions, combined with primitive sanitation and the presence of rats and fleas, meant that once plague entered a castle, it could spread through the entire population within days. Contemporary accounts describe entire castle garrisons being wiped out, not by enemy action, but by disease. The Chronicle of Moe Abbey records that in 1349, the great castle of Skipton was left with but 3 men alive, all others having perished of the pestilence. Similar accounts can be found throughout medieval Europe, testament to how the very features that made castles militarily effective also made them perfect environments for epidemic disease. The irony of medieval castle design becomes even more apparent when we consider how these fortresses affected the mental health of their inhabitants. The same isolation that provided security from external threats also created conditions of psychological stress that could be just as deadly as any physical danger. Medieval castles were designed to be self-sufficient during extended sieges, which meant that their inhabitants often lived in virtual isolation for months or even years at a time. The thick walls that kept enemies out also kept residents in, creating an environment that modern psychologists would recognize as profoundly unhealthy. The limited natural light that filtered through the narrow arrow slits, combined with the constant dampness and poor air circulation, created conditions that we now know contribute to depression and other mental health disorders. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of castle residents who suffered from what they called melancholia, a condition that often led to suicide or other self-destructive behaviours. The case of Isabella de Fortibus, Countess of Devon and Lady of the Isle of Wight, provides a particularly poignant example of how castle life could affect mental health. After inheriting several castles following her husband's death in 1262, Isabella became increasingly reclusive, rarely leaving her fortress of Carisbrooke Castle. Contemporary accounts describe her as becoming much given to strange fancies and dark moods, and she eventually died alone in her castle in 1293, having lived the last 30 years of her life in virtual isolation. But the psychological toll of castle life wasn't limited to the nobility. Servants, guards, and other castle residents also suffered from the effects of living in what were essentially stone prisons. The constant threat of violence, combined with the claustrophobic conditions and social isolation, created an environment where mental breakdown was not uncommon. Medieval records speak of castle servants who suffered from what they called castle fever, a condition characterized by violent outbursts, paranoid delusions, and sometimes suicide. Modern historians have suggested that this may have been an early description of what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder or severe depression brought on by the conditions of castle life. The defensive features of medieval castles also created unique forms of accidental death specific to these environments. The concentric design of many castles, with multiple walls and courtyards, created numerous opportunities for people to fall from great heights. The wall walks that connected different sections of the castle were often narrow and lacked proper railings, making them particularly dangerous during bad weather or at night. One particularly deadly feature of many castles was the Great Hall's gallery, a raised platform that allowed important guests to observe festivities below. These galleries were often built with minimal safety features, and medieval chronicles record numerous instances of people falling to their deaths during feasts and celebrations. The case of Roger Mortimer, Earl of March, illustrates how even the most powerful nobles were not immune to the dangers of castle architecture. In 1398, Mortimer fell to his death from the gallery of his own great hall at Wigmore Castle, while attempting to get a better view of a tournament taking place in the courtyard below. The very feature designed to display his power and status became the instrument of his death. Perhaps most insidiously, the water systems of medieval castles created ongoing health hazards that affected every resident. Castles required enormous amounts of water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and firefighting. But the sources of this water were often contaminated by the castle's own waste systems. Many castles drew their water from wells that had been dug within the castle walls for security reasons. However, these wells were often located dangerously close to the castle's waste disposal systems, creating a constant risk of contamination. The same moats that provided defensive advantages also became stagnant pools of disease-carrying water that could poison anyone who came into contact with them. The Castle of Caerphilly, mentioned earlier for its impressive water defences, provides a perfect example of how defensive water features could become health hazards. The elaborate system of lakes and channels that made the castle nearly impossible to attack also created perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other disease-carrying insects. Medieval records show that the castle's garrisons suffered from regular outbreaks of marsh fever, almost certainly malaria transmitted by mosquitoes breeding in the stagnant water. As we've seen, medieval castles were indeed death traps, but not always in the ways their builders intended. While these fortresses were certainly effective at keeping enemies out, they were equally effective at trapping their own inhabitants in environments hostile to human health and safety. The thick walls, narrow passages, and defensive features that made castles militarily formidable also made them perfect environments for accidents, disease, and psychological breakdown. The very isolation that provided security also created conditions of stress and deprivation that could be just as deadly as any enemy sword. In our exploration of why medieval castles were death traps, we've only begun to scratch the surface of the dangers that lurked within these stone fortresses. The entrance halls and outer defences we've examined today were just the beginning of a castle's deadly features. The spiral staircases that wound through castle towers, the great halls where nobles feasted and plotted, the kitchens where massive fires created constant hazards, and the dungeons where prisoners faced unimaginable horrors. Each of these spaces presented unique and deadly challenges to anyone who entered them. The medieval world was a dangerous place, and the castles that dominated its landscape were perfect reflections of that danger. Built in an age when violence was commonplace and human life was cheap, these fortresses prioritized military effectiveness over human comfort or safety. The result was a form of architecture that was as deadly to its inhabitants as it was to its enemies. As we continue our journey through the deadly secrets of medieval castles, we'll discover that these stone fortresses were not just military installations or noble residences. They were complex machines designed to control, intimidate, and, when necessary, kill. Every stone was placed with purpose, every passage designed with deadly intent, and every room constructed to serve the brutal realities of medieval warfare. The next time you visit a medieval castle and admire its impressive architecture, remember that you're looking at one of history's most sophisticated instruments of death. Behind every beautiful arch and imposing tower lies a dark history of violence, disease, and accidental death that claimed countless lives over the centuries these fortresses stood guard over the medieval world. The unseen killers, structural flaws, and primitive materials. Beyond the direct dangers of falling stone, disease, and structural collapse, medieval castles harboured more subtle yet equally deadly threats rooted in their very design and the limitations of the age. One such pervasive danger was the poor quality of building materials and construction techniques. The mortar binding those massive stone blocks together was often mixed with whatever materials were readily available. Lime, sand, and water formed the basic recipe, but desperate builders frequently added organic matter like animal hair, blood, or even human waste to strengthen the mixture. Over time, this organic material would decay, creating pockets of weakness that could cause entire sections of wall to crumble without warning. Such collapses, whether sudden or gradual, posed an existential threat to anyone below or living within the affected section of the castle. The relentless forces of gravity, wind, and rain constantly probed these weaknesses, making every passing storm a potential harbinger of disaster. The integrity of the very fabric of the castle was, in many cases, fundamentally compromised from day one. The stones themselves told their own grim tale. Quarried from local sources, they were often of inconsistent quality and composition. Some were porous and absorbed moisture like sponges, expanding and contracting with the seasons until they cracked and split. Others contained iron deposits that would rust over time, staining the walls with streaks of red that looked disturbingly like dried blood. When these iron-rich stones finally gave way, they could send cascades of razor-sharp fragments raining down on anyone unlucky enough to be below. The lack of standardized building codes or sophisticated geological surveys meant that builders relied on local stone, often without fully understanding its long-term durability or susceptibility to erosion and decay. This gamble with foundational materials meant that many castles were, from their very inception, ticking time bombs of structural failure, waiting for the right combination of weather and age to reveal their deadly secrets. The wooden elements within castle walls presented their own catalogue of horrors. Massive oak beams, some weighing several tons, were held in place by primitive joinery techniques and iron fittings that corroded over time. When these supports failed, they didn't fail quietly. They came crashing down with bone-crushing force, often triggered by nothing more than a strong wind or the vibrations from heavy footsteps above. The Great Hall of Kenilworth Castle still bears scars from one such collapse in the 14th century, when a supporting beam gave way during a feast, killing 12 guests instantly. The continuous flexing and settling of these enormous timber structures under immense loads led to constant stresses, weakening joints and loosening pegs over decades until an inevitable and catastrophic failure occurred, often with little to no warning, turning a celebratory space into a scene of unimaginable tragedy. But perhaps nowhere were the structural dangers more concentrated than in the castle's towers. These soaring monuments to medieval ambition were essentially vertical death traps, their spiral staircases winding upward in an endless helical nightmare. The steps themselves were carved from stone, but decades of foot traffic, often by hundreds of individuals in heavy boots, had worn them smooth and treacherous. In wet weather, or when covered in mud from outside, they became as slippery as ice. The medieval chronicler Matthew Paris recorded one particularly gruesome incident at the Tower of London, where a guard carrying a torch slipped on the rain-slicked steps and tumbled down 3 full flights, his burning torch setting fire to the rushes scattered on the landing below. The tight, winding nature of these staircases, combined with the lack of handrails, inconsistent step heights, and the perpetual gloom, made them treacherous navigation hazards for everyone, from armoured knights to humble servants carrying heavy loads, turning every ascent and descent into a dangerous test of balance and luck. The narrow windows that punctuated these towers, designed to admit just enough light to see by, while remaining defensible, created their own hazards. Children and small adults could easily slip through the wider arrow slits, plummeting to their deaths on the unforgiving rocks below. The window seats carved from the same stone as the walls were positioned at exactly the wrong height to provide safety, too low to serve as proper barriers, too high to step over easily. They became stumbling blocks that sent countless castle residents tumbling backward into empty air. These openings, while critical for defence against external threats, were fatal flaws in terms of everyday safety, a grim testament to the absolute prioritisation of military function over human well-being. Even the act of gazing out could lead to a swift and brutal demise. Hidden perils, water, fire, and the everyday environment. Even the castle's water systems, essential for survival during sieges, harboured deadly secrets. Wells were often dug so deep that their sides became unstable, collapsing without warning and entombing anyone unlucky enough to be drawing water at the time. The elaborate systems that collected rainwater from the castle's roofs became breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other disease-carrying insects, introducing new vectors for illness. Worse still, these standing pools of water often became contaminated with the decaying corpses of birds, rats, and occasionally human remains that had fallen from the battlements above. The lack of modern plumbing meant water had to be transported manually, often in heavy buckets up multiple flights of stairs, creating additional opportunities for falls, muscle strains, and injuries in the process. Each journey for water was a small, potentially fatal expedition. The castle's kitchens, located in separate buildings or the ground floor to reduce fire risk, presented their own unique dangers. The massive open hearths roared with flames that could reach temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, their hungry mouths demanding constant feeding with timber and charcoal. Kitchen servants, already weakened by poor nutrition and exhausting labour, worked in clouds of choking smoke that filled their lungs with soot and ash, leading to chronic respiratory problems. The heat was so intense that cooks frequently collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies unable to cope with the relentless assault of scorching air and billowing smoke. But the fires were only the beginning of the kitchen's deadly arsenal. Enormous cauldrons, some large enough to hold an entire pig, hung suspended over the flames on chains that had been forged decades earlier. Metal fatigue was a concept unknown to medieval engineers, and these chains would snap without warning, sending hundreds of pounds of boiling liquid and scalding metal crashing down upon anyone unfortunate enough to be working below. The stone floors, perpetually slick with grease and spilled liquids, became treacherous skating rinks, where a single misstep could send a servant tumbling into the blazing hearth. The chaotic, intense environment of a medieval kitchen, with sharp knives, boiling liquids, and open flames, was a constant theatre of potential disaster, exacerbated by exhaustion, poor visibility, and the primitive tools available. The great halls where castle life centred were perhaps the most deceptively dangerous spaces of all. Their soaring timber roofs, marvels of medieval engineering, were held together by complex networks of wooden joints and iron bolts. Over time, the immense weight of these structures, combined with the stresses of weather and the inherent weaknesses of the materials, would cause the walls to bow outward, creating stress fractures that spiderwebbed through the stone. When these roofs finally collapsed, they did so with such force that they could punch through multiple floors below, creating vertical shafts of destruction that claimed lives throughout the castle. The sheer scale of these halls meant that any failure had widespread, devastating consequences for anyone below, transforming a space of communal gathering into a mass grave. The floors themselves were another source of constant peril. In the finest castles, they might be covered with elaborately painted tiles, but these decorative surfaces became treacherously slippery when wet, leading to dangerous falls. More commonly, floors were simply packed earth covered with rushes or straw. This organic matter, mixed with spilled food, human waste, and the blood from countless small injuries, created a festering carpet that harboured disease and concealed dangerous obstacles. Chroniclers tell of nobles breaking their necks after tripping over refuse hidden beneath the floor coverings. These unsanitary and uneven surfaces guaranteed a continuous risk of slips, falls, and infections from open wounds, making simply walking a hazardous activity. The very furniture within these castles was designed more for display and permanence than safety. Massive wooden tables, benches, and chairs were built to last centuries, but their sheer weight made them capable of crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be caught beneath them when they toppled. The great chair in the hall at Warwick Castle, carved from a single piece of oak and weighing nearly half a ton, was said to have killed 3 earls over the course of 2 centuries, each crushed when the ancient wood finally gave way beneath them. These immovable, often cumbersome objects were hazards in themselves, particularly in dim light or during crowded events, posing a blunt, inescapable threat. Perhaps most insidiously dangerous were the castle's decorative elements. Tapestries hanging on cold, damp stone walls might seem harmless, but they were death traps waiting to happen. Woven from wool and treated with various chemicals to preserve their colours, they were essentially enormous candles waiting for a spark. When they caught fire, they burned with terrifying speed, filling rooms with thick, toxic smoke and creating walls of flame that blocked escape routes. The heavy metal rings and rods used to hang these tapestries frequently pulled free from crumbling mortar, sending yards of burning fabric cascading down onto anyone below. What was meant to be beautiful and insulating became an inferno. The iron braziers used to heat these vast, often drafty spaces were equally treacherous. Filled with glowing charcoal or burning wood, they gave off deadly carbon monoxide in poorly ventilated rooms. Castle dwellers would simply fall asleep and never wake up, victims of an invisible killer that left no trace, a silent asphyxiation in their own living quarters. The braziers themselves, often standing on 3 or 4 unstable legs, were notoriously wobbly. A careless bump or a warped leg could send burning coals scattering across wooden floors or into piles of straw bedding, sparking yet another fire hazard and a potential catastrophe. Even the most basic activities of daily life were fraught with danger in these stone fortresses. Climbing stairs in the dark was a nightly gamble with death, as the uneven steps worn by centuries of footsteps and low ceilings created a perfect storm of hazards. The narrow corridors that connected different parts of the castle were often pitch black, forcing residents to navigate by feel along walls that might conceal sharp projections, loose stones, or sudden openings that led to fatal drops. A simple trip or stumble in these unlit labyrinths could easily prove fatal, leaving broken bones or a broken neck in the darkness. The seasonal changes that brought relief to those living in the countryside only intensified the dangers within castle walls. Winter ice made every surface treacherous, turning courtyards and wall walks into dangerous skating rinks. Spring thaws could cause catastrophic structural failures as frozen mortar expanded and contracted, dislodging stones. Summer heat would cause the iron fittings throughout the castle to expand, sometimes bursting through the stone that contained them, creating new weaknesses. Autumn storms would send loose stones tumbling from the battlements and tear away sections of roof that had been weakened by years of weather. The very elements that shaped the landscape outside also constantly worked to dismantle the castles themselves, turning them into dynamic, dangerous environments. Yet, for all these dangers, medieval people continued to build and inhabit these stone fortresses, driven by the harsh realities of their violent age. They accepted the risks because the alternatives were often worse. A castle might be a death trap, but it was also the only refuge available in a world where warfare was constant and survival uncertain. The very features that made these structures so dangerous to their inhabitants also made them formidable barriers to their enemies, a trade-off they grimly accepted. The all-encompassing threat of disease and vermin. Beyond the myriad physical dangers and structural flaws, medieval castles were fertile ground for an array of diseases, a silent, relentless enemy that claimed countless lives. The primitive sanitation systems we discussed earlier were just the tip of the iceberg. The lack of understanding of germ theory meant that hygiene, as we know it, was virtually non-existent. Waste from guardrobes discharged directly below the castle, festering in moats or open pits, creating a putrid miasma. This attracted swarms of flies and other disease-carrying insects that would then carry pathogens directly back into the living quarters, landing on food, drink, and human skin. The sheer density of the castle population during sieges compounded this problem dramatically. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, soldiers, servants, noble families and their retainers, would be crammed into a relatively small, poorly ventilated space. This created ideal conditions for airborne diseases to spread like wildfire. A single cough, sneeze, or an infected individual could quickly decimate an entire garrison. With no antibiotics or effective treatments, illnesses like influenza, tuberculosis, measles, and pneumonia could sweep through a castle as effectively as any enemy army. Medieval chronicles often speak of fluxes or fevers sweeping through castles, wiping out entire families or fighting forces in a matter of days, often rendering a strategically vital fortress utterly useless without a single arrow being fired. The castle's reliance on stored food and water during extended sieges also presented enormous, often fatal, health risks. While intended to provide sustenance and resilience, these provisions frequently became contaminated. Grains and other foodstuffs stored in damp, dark cellars were prone to mold and fungal growth, which could produce potent mycotoxins when consumed, leading to severe illness or death. Water, drawn from wells that were inevitably susceptible to runoff from latrines, stables, and animal pens, was a constant source of waterborne diseases. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid were common scourges, turning the very act of eating and drinking into a gamble with death. The siege of Harlech Castle in the 15th century, for example, saw its defenders decimated more by illness and starvation than by direct combat, a common and agonizing fate for many besieged garrisons. The water of life often became the water of death. Vermin, specifically rats and fleas, were ubiquitous in medieval castles and served as horrifyingly efficient vectors for some of the deadliest diseases known to mankind. The accumulation of human and animal waste, spilled food scraps, and straw bedding created ideal breeding grounds for these creatures. Rats, scurrying through walls, across floors, and into food stores, spread disease directly through their droppings and urine. More famously, they carried the fleas responsible for transmitting the bubonic plague. Once the Black Death entered a castle, its confined, unsanitary conditions, coupled with the high population density, ensured its rapid and devastating spread. There are chilling accounts of castles where only a handful of inhabitants survived. The rest succumbed to the pestilence, demonstrating how the castle, designed to keep danger out, often amplified it within, becoming a macabre monument to the unseen enemy. Even the animal inhabitants of a castle, while essential for daily life and defence, contributed significantly to the overall danger. Horses in stables produced vast amounts of waste, attracting flies and creating noxious fumes. Hunting dogs and guard dogs, while loyal, could turn aggressive, and a bite from an animal in an age before proper wound care and rabies vaccinations was often a death sentence due to infection. Livestock kept within the outer bailey during sieges to provide food further exacerbated sanitation problems, turning confined spaces into cesspools of waste and disease. Even the birds kept for sport, like falcons, could carry zoonotic diseases. The close proximity of humans and animals, combined with primitive hygiene, created a perfect ecosystem for pathogens to jump species and decimate the castle population, illustrating a fundamental biological vulnerability. Psychological and social pressures, the silent toll. Beyond the myriad physical dangers and structural flaws, medieval castle life exacted a heavy psychological toll on its inhabitants, a silent, pervasive killer often overlooked. The very isolation that provided security from external threats also created conditions of profound mental stress. During extended sieges, inhabitants might live in virtual isolation for months or even years, cut off from news, family outside, and the natural rhythms of the wider world. This created an environment that modern psychologists would recognize as deeply unhealthy. The thick walls that kept enemies out also kept residents in, fostering a suffocating sense of claustrophobia and extreme deprivation of sensory and social stimulation. The limited natural light that filtered through narrow arrow slits, combined with the constant dampness, cold and poor air circulation, contributed significantly to seasonal affective disorder and generalized depression. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of castle residents suffering from what they called melancholia, a condition often leading to despair, reclusiveness, and even self-destructive behaviours, including suicide. The poignant case of Isabella de Fortibus, Countess of Devon, highlights this. After inheriting several castles following her husband's death in 1262, Isabella became increasingly reclusive, rarely leaving her fortress of Carisbrooke Castle. Contemporary accounts describe her as becoming much given to strange fancies and dark moods, and she eventually died alone in her castle in 1293, having lived the last 30 years of her life in virtual isolation, a prisoner of her own protective walls and her declining mental state. The constant threat of violence, whether from active siege, internal strife, or the Lord's arbitrary justice, created a pervasive atmosphere of anxiety and paranoia. For soldiers, the expectation of brutal, often hand-to-hand combat in confined, chaotic spaces led to chronic stress and trauma. For servants and commoners, the threat of harsh punishment, physical abuse, or simply being caught in the crossfire of noble disputes was ever present, making every day unpredictable and fearful. This constant low-grade fear, combined with extreme physical hardship, poor diet, and sleep deprivation, could lead to what medieval records sometimes described as castle fever, a condition characterized by violent outbursts, paranoid delusions, and even suicide. Modern historians now speculate this may have been an early manifestation of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or severe clinical depression, brought on by the unique and brutal conditions of castle life, a mental breakdown under relentless pressure. Furthermore, the rigid feudal hierarchy within the castle walls contributed to profound social pressures and inequalities that could be lethal. Life was cheap, especially for the lower classes. Servants were often overworked, underfed, and exposed to the most dangerous tasks with little recompense or recourse. Accidents were common, and deaths from exhaustion, exposure, or untreated injuries were frequent, often unrecorded, and unmourned. Disputes among knights, the Lord's arbitrary justice, or the brutality of guards could lead to summary executions or fatal beatings for perceived offences, with no legal protection for the victim. The castle, while a symbol of power, was also a self-contained society where power imbalances could be, and often were, lethal. Betrayal, suspicion, and infighting were not uncommon among the nobility and their retainers, turning the fortress into a gilded cage or a stone prison, even for its most privileged inhabitants, where political manoeuvring and personal vendettas could lead to quiet, murderous ends. As we conclude this grim tour of medieval castles, it becomes abundantly clear that these impressive structures were less fortresses of safety and more intricate, multi-layered death traps. From their deceptive approaches and cunning entranceways to their disease-ridden interiors, hidden architectural flaws, the silent threat of fire and poor air, and the insidious psychological toll they took, every aspect of a medieval castle seemed designed to eliminate life, whether by intentional design for enemies or by sheer unforgiving consequence for its residents. They stand as stone testaments to an era where survival was a daily struggle, and where the very concept of home often carried the chilling whisper of one's own mortality. The grandeur and romanticized image of castles often overshadow the stark, brutal reality of daily existence within their walls, a reality where death was an ever-present companion, a grim fixture of medieval life, proving that sometimes the greatest danger lies not outside, but within. Welcome, welcome, my dear, delightful denizens of, well, wherever you happen to be. And good gracious, what time is it where you are? I'm here, perched precariously on the precipice of exactly 9:44 p.m. East European summertime 2025. Yes, the future is now, and it smells faintly of elderflower and regret. but enough about my present. We're about to embark on a grand, glorious, and perhaps a tad grimy journey back in time. Now, before we plunge headfirst into the putrid delights of Victorian London, and trust me, there are many putrid delights, do me a solid, my fellow temporal travellers. Don't be a stranger. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're currently huddled and what ungodly hour the hands of your clock are currently clutching. Are you sipping lukewarm tea in Tokyo at dawn, munching on midnight snacks in Minneapolis? Or, heaven forbid, are you also in Romania, experiencing this very moment of temporal oddity with me? It's always a comfort to know how far our little band of nocturnal historians reaches, and if by some stroke of pure, unadulterated madness you find yourself enjoying these quiet, story-rich rambles through times gone by, do hit that subscribe button. Think of it as your nightly lullaby, a guaranteed ticket to drift off to the past, wrapped in the comforting blanket of, well, my voice. You'll be dreaming of top hats and street urchins in no time. But for now, my friends, my fiends, my fellow adventurers, let us hark. Let us turn back the clock. Let us journey to the 19th century, to an era of grand palaces and, well, let's just say as ye slums is a polite way of putting it. It was a time of empire and industry, of brilliant achievements and human misery. The Victorian age, my dears, was a study in contrasts, a veritable Jekyll and Hyde of an era, especially in the teeming, thrumming, thoroughly sweaty capital of London. For beneath the stately edifices and glittering balls of the upper crust, where people danced the quadrille and debated the merits of a good monocle, lay a vast, sprawling, absolutely reeking underworld of gut-wrenching poverty. Here, merely surviving the day was not just a feat, it was an Olympic sport with no medals, only festering sores and the constant threat of being run over by a runaway cab. Imagine, if you will, the grim and gritty streets of London's East End. Don't just imagine them, smell them. Go on, take a deep sniff. Can you detect the subtle bouquet of despair mingled with, let's see, stale beer, unwashed humanity, and the lingering essence of 1,000 forgotten dreams? Rickety tenements teetering precariously, looking like they'd lose a wrestling match with a strong gust of wind. Dank alleys, where the only thing thriving was the questionable moss and even more questionable intentions. And the air, oh, the air! It hung heavy, thick, and surprisingly chewable with the stench of sewage and, dare I say, existential dread. Here, my friends, the working poor were crammed into crumbling hovels. Not just families, mind you, but entire families. We're talking 3 generations, Aunt Mildred's pet rat, and Uncle Bartholomew's questionable collection of pickled onions, all squeezed into a single fetid room with about as much light and air as a badger's burrow. The slums of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. Ah, those notorious rookeries. A charming name, isn't it? Sounds like a delightful bird sanctuary, until you realise the birds are actually a metaphor for disease-ridden rats. And the sanctuary is overflowing with rubbish and waste, festering underfoot like a particularly aggressive science experiment. Sanitation? My dear listener, that was an unknown luxury. It was like asking for a unicorn that could tap dance and recite Shakespeare. With no proper sewers or running water, human waste and rotting garbage would moulder in reeking cesspools and overflowing gutters, creating a symphony of smells that would make a seasoned sailor blanch. And it's in these wretched streets, these urban purgatories, that we meet our hero for the evening, young Jack. A spindly, 12-year-old lad with fingers quicker than a politician changing their stance and eyes sharper than a hawk spotting a particularly plump foal. By day, Jack was what you might call a mudlark. Not a particularly glamorous job, unless your definition of glamorous involves wading through thick, putrid muck along the River Thames at low tide. He was one of the many children who would brave the squelch and squish, searching for lumps of coal, the black gold of the Victorian era, bits of rope, or, if the river gods were smiling upon him, a shiny copper coin dropped by a passing dignitary. Imagine the scene. The muck sucks at his bare feet, the shards of glass and pottery slicing his soles. A delightful foot massage, I'm sure. But Jack, bless his resilient little heart, didn't mind. It was a good day when he found enough coal to keep his family's hearthfire burning for a few precious hours. A truly heartwarming thought, isn't it? The difference between a slightly chilly hovel and a completely freezing one. But wait, there's more. Jack wasn't just a mudlark. Oh no, our Jack was an overachiever. He was also a tosher. And what, you might ask, is a tosher? Well, my curious comrades, a tosher is a sewer hunter. Yes, you heard me right. A brave, perhaps slightly unhinged individual who wades through the foul underground channels in the hopes of finding something valuable washed down from the streets above. I'm talking lost jewellery, dropped coins, perhaps a particularly valuable discarded potato. The possibilities were endless and equally disgusting. He'd hold his breath against the vile stench, squinting in the dim, watery light filtering through the grates above, always listening for the telltale rush that meant the tide was turning. To be caught in the sewers when the water rose meant almost certain death. A truly unpleasant way to go, if you ask me. Imagine your last moments being spent submerged in that. But it was a risk Jack was willing to take for a chance at a few coins to fill his family's perpetually growling bellies. Now, you might be thinking, good heavens, that sounds absolutely dreadful. And you'd be right. But here's the kicker. Jack was one of the lucky ones. Yes, lucky, if you can even call it that. At least he had a family. At least he had a place to lay his head at night, even if it was just a filthy corner of a crowded room, sharing body heat with half a dozen relatives and a rogue cockroach. For those with nowhere else to turn, the workhouses beckoned. Oh, the workhouses. They sounded so inviting, didn't they? Come on in, weary traveller. We promise a meal and a bed. But they were hardly a haven. They were more like, well, imagine a particularly grim Victorian-era version of a budget airline flight. Within their grim walls, the destitute traded their freedom for a crust of bread and a place on a thin, lumpy pallet. Families were separated, meagre belongings confiscated. Oh, is that your grandma's prized thimble? Sorry, dear, that's ours now. And dignity stripped away faster than a street urchin can swipe a sausage. The able-bodied were put to work breaking stones, an activity designed specifically to break spirits, or picking oakum, which involved unpicking old ropes into loose fibres. Thrilling stuff, I assure you. Meanwhile, the elderly and infirm languished in dank wards, probably dreaming of a day when their only exertion was lifting a teacup. Dinner? A tasteless gruel, ladled into crude bowls, and yet, for many, it was still better than starving on the streets. A truly shining endorsement of institutionalized misery, wouldn't you say? One who knew the workhouses all too well was Annie Chapman, a young woman who, tragically, would later meet a grisly end at the hands of Jack the Ripper. As a girl, Annie had stayed in the workhouses when her family fell on hard times. She would later resort to prostitution to survive, walking the dingy streets of Whitechapel, her thin shawl scant protection against the biting cold and the leering glances of the men who prowled the alleyways. A brutal existence, to say the least, and a stark reminder that for many there were precious few options, for those who managed to avoid the workhouses, perhaps by sheer force of will, or by having an uncanny ability to disappear into a cloud of smoke. A job might be found along the bustling docks of the Thames. The Port of London was a hive of activity, a vibrant, chaotic symphony of creaking ropes, shouting men, and the incessant squawking of gulls. Ships from every corner of the globe unloaded their exotic wares, spices, silks, perhaps a crate of particularly pungent cheese. Brawny dockers hefted crates and barrels, their backs straining under the heavy loads. Accidents were as common as fog, with little to no regard for the safety of the workers. A broken bone, a crushed limb. Oh dear, what a shame. That could spell destitution for a man and his family. Because in Victorian London, if you couldn't work, you simply didn't eat. It was a very simple, very brutal equation. Other men sweated long hours in the factories and sweatshops that belched smoke into the already murky sky, turning it a rather fetching shade of industrial grey, in crowded rooms lit by flickering gaslights, which, by the way, smelled like a leaky stove and 1,000 bad decisions, They tended rattling machines and boiling vats. Women and children toiled alongside them, their nimble fingers darting as they stitched garments or assembled small parts. The hours were long, the pay was measly, and the dangers, the dangers were plentiful, varied, and often quite gruesome. In 1888, a young activist named Annie Besant, and bless her heart for it, drew back the curtain on the horrors of the Bryant and May match factory. The matchstick girls, some as young as 12, worked 14-hour days in rooms choked with white phosphorus fumes. Imagine breathing that in. Many developed a truly grotesque deformity known as phossy jaw, their faces quite literally eaten away by the toxic chemical. Not exactly a glowing endorsement for child labour, is it? Besant's exposé on this white slavery shocked the public. Well, some of the public at least, and helped spur the famous London Matchgirl strike of 1888, a small but significant victory against the crushing wheels of industrial indifference. For the poor souls of the East End, the relentless drudgery of their daily lives was occasionally punctuated by a glorious, if fleeting, escape into oblivion. Opium, flooding in from British India, was cheap and plentiful. In the dark, hazy dens that dotted the slums, hollow-eyed men and women would sprawl on stained mattresses, lost in a narcotic haze. For a few precious hours, they could forget the gnawing hunger, the ache of weary bones, and the ever-present threat of eviction, a temporary passport to a world without pain, however artificial. And then there was gin. Gin, the other great leveller, offering a brief respite at the bottom of a bottle. The garish gin palaces, with their tawdry gaslights and sawdust-strewn floors, beckoned with the promise of cheap liquor and raucous company. But the merriment, as it often does with cheap liquor and desperation, often descended into brawls and despairing sobs. Drunkenness stalked the streets, drowning sorrows, yes, but also fueling violence and vice. It was a vicious cycle, often ending with a head in a gutter and a pocket full of regrets. The streets themselves were often shrouded in a dense, noxious fog. Not just any fog, mind you, but a proper pea-souper. Born from thousands of coal fires belching sooty smoke into the damp air, these fogs could linger for days, turning midday into midnight. Imagine walking through a thick yellow-brown soup. In the swirling gloom, the gaslights cast eerie, dancing shadows, making the already twisted alleys even more menacing. It was in these fog-choked streets that a very real terror gripped the city in the autumn of 1888. A sinister figure was on the prowl in Whitechapel, brutally slaying women and vanishing into the night as if he were a phantom made of smoke and shadows. The newspapers, always one for a catchy headline, dubbed him Jack the Ripper, and his grisly crimes ignited a frenzy of fear and morbid fascination. One by one, the bodies of 5 women, all impoverished prostitutes, were discovered, horribly mutilated. The police seemed powerless to stop the carnage, their investigations stymied by the dark, twisting streets, the suffocating fog, and, let's be honest, probably a fair bit of incompetence. Wild theories flew as to the identity of the fiend. Was he a doctor, a butcher, a foreign sailor with a particularly nasty hobby, or even, gasp, a member of the royal family? Despite the best efforts of the police, and by best efforts, I mean a lot of shouting and running in circles, Jack the Ripper was never unmasked. His dark legend lives on, a chilling symbol of the dangers and degradations that stalked the women of the Victorian East End. For those who lived and died in those mean streets, there was little justice, and even less mercy. Indeed, death was a constant spectre, a looming shadow in Victorian London, especially for the poor. Disease ran rampant in the filthy, overcrowded slums. Cholera, spread by tainted water, could fell a strong man in a matter of hours. Typhoid, tuberculosis, and smallpox claimed countless lives, often wiping out entire families with ruthless efficiency. For the upper classes, mourning was an art form. Elaborate rituals, strict codes of etiquette, it was practically a competitive sport. Queen Victoria herself famously wore black for 40 years after the death of her beloved Prince Albert. 40 years. Imagine the dry cleaning bill. But for the poor, even a proper burial was often out of reach. The desperate resorted to the services of the resurrection men. Sounds delightful, doesn't it? Like a religious revival. But no, these were grave robbers, my friends, who snatched fresh corpses to sell to eager anatomists for dissection. The idea of one's loved ones being carved up on a surgeon's slab only added to the misery and dread. Because, being poor wasn't quite miserable enough already. Strangely, this grim world of the poor held a certain fascination for the well-to-do. Slumming became a fashionable pastime. Picture it. Gentile ladies in their finest silks, gawking tourists with their guidebooks, all trekking through the East End hovels, eager for a glimpse of how the other half lived. They gawked at the ragged children, recoiled from the stinking alleys, perhaps tossing a few coins to salve their consciences, like throwing breadcrumbs to particularly unfortunate pigeons. Some, like the journalist Henry Mayhew and a young Charles Dickens, sought to chronicle the lives of the poor, to give voice to their struggles and their sorrows. Their writings helped to spur a growing movement for social reform, a recognition that perhaps something had to be done to alleviate the sufferings of the underclass. A radical thought, I know, but change, as it always does, was slow to come to the fetid streets and alleys. It took the great stink of 1858, and yes, it was precisely as appealing as it sounds, when the stench of raw sewage in the Thames became so overpowering that Parliament was forced to act. Imagine the scene. Politicians accustomed to their ivory towers suddenly confronted with a smell so vile it could strip paint from a wall. They practically sprinted to approve funding for a proper sewer system. Even then, the grand brick tunnels that still serve London today were built more to protect the delicate noses of the elite than to safeguard the health of the poor. Because priorities, darling. Gradually, however, glimmers of progress began to penetrate the gloom. Social reformers like Dr. Thomas Barnardo opened shelters for orphans and street children. The Salvation Army ministered to the destitute with its promise of soup, soap and salvation. A rather appealing package deal, if you ask me. New model tenements offered a glimpse of a better life, with running water and, gasp, private balconies. Imagine the luxury, a place to hang your laundry that wasn't over a cesspool. But for most of the Victorian poor, the grinding hardship and heartache remained the constant backdrop of their brief, blighted lives. They toiled and scraped and suffered, eking out a tenuous existence in the shadows of the glittering wealth and glory of the British Empire. Their struggles may be largely lost to history, relegated to dusty textbooks and morbid documentaries, but they are crucial threads in the vast, complex tapestry of the human story. As we look back at Victorian London, at its fog-shrouded streets and its gaslit horrors, we see a city of towering contrasts, of magnificent achievements and gut-wrenching misery, of glittering opulence and abject despair. It was an age of progress, yes, but also of ruthless exploitation, of soaring hopes and dashed dreams. The poor may have been swept to the margins, ignored and reviled, but their lives mattered. Their stories deserve to be told. So let us remember them, these forgotten souls who lived and died in the shadows of history. Let us marvel at their resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship, and let us mourn for the lives cut short by poverty, disease, and despair. Above all, let us learn from their struggles and let their suffering spur us to build a world of greater justice, compassion, and opportunity for all. And with that, dear listener, we come to the end of this particular journey through the dark streets of Victorian London. I hope that this small window into the past has given you a deeper appreciation for the struggles and triumphs of those who came before us. May their stories linger with you as you drift off to sleep, and may you awaken with a renewed sense of empathy and compassion for all those who still suffer in the shadows of our bright, shining world. Until next time, this is your humble guide to the bygone days, bidding you a fond good night. May your dreams be sweeter than the harsh realities of the past, and may you find solace in the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit endures. Good night. Oh, but wait, we've only scratched the surface, haven't we? This is Victorian London, my friends, a place so ripe with misery and mayhem we could spend a week here. The pain and misery of London's poor, you see, began to stir the conscience of wider society in the Victorian era. Not everyone was content to simply gawk from their carriages. Social reformers and philanthropists, bless their well-meaning souls, took up the cause, advocating for change and working to provide some measure of relief to the suffering masses. One such crusader was none other than Charles Dickens. Yes, that Charles Dickens, the beloved novelist whose vivid depictions of poverty and injustice helped awaken the public to the plight of the underclass. Now, Dickens, born in 1812, knew firsthand the sting of hardship. This wasn't some posh aristocrat pontificating from a gilded cage. Oh no. As a boy, his father was sent to debtor's prison, a charming Victorian institution that basically said, "Can't pay your bills? Enjoy this tiny rat-infested room," forcing young Charles to leave school and work in a factory pasting labels on bottles of bootblacking. Imagine the smell. That experience left a deep impression on the sensitive and observant child, probably giving him a lifelong aversion to shoe polish. As Dickens rose to fame as a writer, he used his platform to shed light on the dark underbelly of Victorian society. His novels, my dear listeners, are populated with unforgettable characters drawn from the ranks of the poor and downtrodden. From the orphan Oliver Twist, who famously had the audacity to ask for more gruel in the workhouse, a truly revolutionary act for the time, to Little Nell, a young girl who wanders the industrial wasteland, probably encountering more soot than sunshine. And let's not forget Joe, the crossing sweeper from Bleak House, who knows nothing of the world beyond his meagre street existence. Dickens wove cutting social commentary into his colourful tales of London life, like a particularly skilled tailor sewing a political pamphlet into a waistcoat. He railed against the greed and indifference of the wealthy, and the cruel inhumanity of institutions like the workhouses and debtors' prisons. His immense popularity meant his message reached all the strata of society. It's said that his works did more to raise awareness of poverty than the crusading speeches of any politician, probably because his stories were, interesting. People enjoy a good narrative, even if it makes them feel deeply uncomfortable about the state of the world. Dickens was also instrumental in founding Urania Cottage, a home for young women who had turned to theft or prostitution. Rather than treat them as irredeemable outcasts, the home provided rehabilitation through education, training, and the opportunity for a fresh start, a radically progressive approach for the time. Residents were taught domestic skills like cooking and sewing, with the aim of securing respectable employment, often in the colonies. Because, of course, the colonies were always there for a fresh start, right? The great author's actions revealed his belief that with support and means, even those consigned to society's margins could rise above squalid circumstances. In his own life, he quietly assisted individuals in need, answering a flood of letters appealing for help. Dickens's deep moral conscience and empathy for the poor made him one of the Victorian age's most passionate advocates for their cause. Dickens' life and legacy exemplify how the winds of social change began to stir, however tentatively, amidst the grim poverty of Victorian London. Reformist attitudes slowly gained ground, thanks to activists, politicians, and authors who forced the public to confront the injustices and indignities the poor faced daily. It would be a long, slow road to meaningful progress for society's wretched refuse, but the first halting steps were being taken. Another flicker of light in the gloom came from Baroness Angela Burdett Coates. Now, this woman was a legend, one of the wealthiest women of the Victorian age and a pioneer of philanthropy. Born in 1814 to a prominent banking family, she inherited a vast fortune at the age of 23, instantly becoming one of the richest individuals in England. Most people, upon inheriting such a fortune, might invest in, say, a solid gold carriage or a diamond-encrusted top hat. But rather than indulge in a life of sheer, unadulterated luxury, Angela developed a passion for charitable works. Bless her magnificent philanthropic heart. Burdett Coates focused her efforts on assisting the poor in London's East End, one of the city's most notoriously blighted areas. She financed the construction of model tenements to replace squalid slums, providing clean, affordable housing for hundreds of families. Imagine a place with walls that didn't visibly weep. She established a sewing school to teach young women marketable skills and founded a home for fallen women, those who had resorted to prostitution out of desperation. Her approach was innovative in treating the poor with a measure of dignity and respect, in stark contrast to the harsh judgment and condescension they usually faced from their betters. Burdett Coutts was also groundbreaking in her determination to tackle the roots of poverty, not just provide temporary relief. She funded projects to improve sanitation and access to clean water, rightly seeing that disease and poor hygiene were major factors keeping people trapped in poverty. She was a visionary, a woman who understood that throwing a few pennies at a problem wasn't going to solve it. The Baroness was a fierce advocate for the rights and welfare of children. Appalled by the grim fates of London's impoverished youth, she campaigned against the practice of using young boys as chimney sweeps, one of the era's most brutal and dangerous forms of child labour. Small children were sent scrambling up narrow maze-like chimneys choked with coal soot and carcinogenic creosote. Many suffered respiratory ailments, deformities from contorting their growing bodies, and sometimes suffocated when they became stuck. A truly horrific job, the kind that gives you nightmares just thinking about it. Burdett Coutts used her influence to lobby for protective legislation, resulting in the Chimney Sweepers and Chimneys Regulation Act of 1840, which prohibited the use of children under 16 for this work. A small step, but a monumental one. She was also a key supporter of the Ragged School movement, which established hundreds of free schools to educate poor children and keep them off the streets. Imagine the impact. Giving a child a chance at an education, a chance at a different life, instead of a life spent scrabbling in the mud or up a chimney. Well into her 80s, Burdett Coutts continued to pour her time and fortune into bettering the lives of London's forgotten poor. Contemporaries described her as having an almost saintly aura, her face lined with sympathy and wisdom. Queen Victoria herself was so taken with the Baroness's good works, she proposed elevating her to the peerage, making her the first woman to be made a peer in her own right. Take that, patriarchy. The Baroness's shining example helped inspire a new ethic of philanthropy among Britain's upper crust. It even became fashionable to support charitable causes, and more of London's elite began funneling portions of their wealth to help the needy. High society magazines breathlessly reported on glittering charity balls and the donation goals reached. Of course, some of this was more about keeping up appearances and social one-upmanship than heartfelt benevolence, because even charity can be a competition apparently, but it nonetheless meant an influx of funds to fuel the efforts of reformers. Naturally, this top-down charity was a far cry from truly shifting the balance of power and means in Victorian society. The poor were still viewed more as pitiable objects of mercy than fully equal human beings. Much of the money went to short-term handouts rather than deeper structural changes. A great many among the wealthy still clung to the old Victorian shibboleth that poverty stemmed from moral failing and weak character. Oh, they're just lazy, dear, that's why they're starving. But it was a start. The suffering of the poor could no longer be swept completely out of sight and mind. The ranks of the wretched were no longer completely forsaken, and within the brutal machinery of London's workhouses and factories, we begin to see individual lives take on greater dimension through the extraordinary efforts of these few determined souls. Every school founded, every disease averted, every exploited child rescued. Each was a tiny victory for hope in the face of the era's crushing hardships. As the 19th century wound to a close, the lot of London's labouring poor saw some slow but notable improvements. Grassroots labour movements, having begun to find their footing and rally working people to their cause, won a series of key reforms through dogged activism and pressure. The Reform Act of 1867 extended the vote to more working-class men, giving them a voice in the halls of power for the first time. Imagine the shock in Parliament. What? They get to vote now? The Elementary Education Act of 1870 established a system of government-funded schools, opening the door to education for countless poor children. The Trade Union Act of 1871 legalised unions and protected the right to strike, a major milestone in levelling the field between workers and their employers. And the Factory Act of 1878 set limits on the workday, a move towards more humane labour conditions. Life was still unrelentingly harsh for most poor Londoners as the Victorian era ended, but the seeds of positive change had been planted. The misery and squalor that had once been ignored now stirred a social conscience and sense of responsibility. Attitudes were shifting, albeit gradually, to a belief that even the lowliest souls deserved a modicum of dignity and opportunity. Victorian London will always be remembered for its appalling poverty, but it was also the beginning of a steady march towards justice and equality. In the stories of figures like Charles Dickens and Baroness Burdett Coates, we catch glimmers of what could be achieved when conscience and conviction spurred people to action. Their deeds foreshadow social activism movements that would gather momentum in the 20th century and beyond. So, the next time you stroll past the splendid architecture of central London, the regal halls of Westminster, the grand dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, the palatial facades of the West End mansions, take a moment to reflect on the human cost and suffering woven into their history, but also remember the precious strands of hope and decency stubbornly taking root in those brutal times, and spare a thought for young Jack the Mudlark, scavenging the foul banks of the Thames to scrape by, his bare feet cut and mudded. Imagine the Baroness approaching him, bending down to press a coin into his grubby hand with a kind word. Jack tentatively smiles back, uncomprehending this gesture of pure generosity, so rare in his wretched world. It's a small moment, a tiny ripple of goodness in an ocean of struggle, but it matters. In the individual acts of compassion and selflessness, glinting through the dark despair of the Victorian poor, we find hope for something better, the promise that with enough empathy and determination, we can build a society with dignity for all. Now, speaking of dignity, or the distinct lack thereof, let's circle back to that rather morbid Victorian obsession: death. The Victorian cult of death cast a long, dark shadow over London society. In an era when disease ran rampant and life expectancy hovered around a mere 40 years, yes, 40, death was an ever-present spectre, looming over rich and poor alike. But while the wealthy could afford elaborate funerals and strict mourning rituals, which frankly were often more about showing off your wealth than genuine grief, the poor often suffered unceremonious and undignified ends, their bodies sometimes even snatched by grave robbers for anatomists' grim studies. Delightful, isn't it? Even in death, you couldn't catch a break. Queen Victoria herself was the most prominent face of this morbid obsession. After the untimely death of her beloved husband Prince Albert in 1861, the Queen retreated into a state of deep mourning that would last for the remaining 4 decades of her reign. She donned black crepe dresses, avoided public appearances, and even had her servants lay out Albert's clothes each morning, as if he were still alive. Talk about holding a grudge, against life. This set the tone for her subjects to mimic, as mourning etiquette reached almost absurd heights among the upper classes. Widows were expected to wear full black mourning attire for at least 2 years after their husbands' deaths, with strict rules dictating everything from the width of veils to the dullness of jewellery. Advertisers eagerly promoted merchandise to match the sombre mood, hawking black-bordered stationery, funeral biscuits, because who doesn't love a biscuit with their grief, and specially made mourning clothing that could be rented by those who couldn't afford their own. Even calling cards and letters of condolence followed rigid guidelines. It was a full-time job just to be sad correctly. The prosperous sought to honour and memorialise their dead with increasingly lavish funerals and grave markers. Entire businesses sprang up to cater to the costly affairs, renting out professional mourners to pad the crowd of grievers. Yes, that was a real job. And selling memento mori, small tokens and trinkets incorporating the hair or ashes of the deceased. Imagine wearing a lock of Aunt Mildred's hair around your neck. Post-mortem photography also emerged as a popular way to preserve the likeness of dead loved ones, with carefully staged portraits of propped-up corpses, often the only photographs families would have to remember them by. A truly macabre family album, don't you think? But for London's legions of poor, death was a far bleaker affair, devoid of pomp and ceremony. Many families could barely afford the basic pine coffins, let alone the lofty trappings of Victorian mourning customs. paupers' funerals were a bare-bones business, with multiple bodies sometimes crammed into a single grave in the city's overcrowded cemeteries. The indigent and unknown were buried in unmarked plots, their lives and deaths unrecorded and unmourned by the society that had failed them in life. Even more disheartening was the practice of body snatching by so-called resurrection men. Due to laws restricting the dissection of corpses to executed criminals, because, only criminals deserve to be cut open, the growing ranks of anatomists and medical students faced a severe shortage of subjects to study. So, what did they do? A lucrative black market trade arose, with grave robbers plundering the coffins of the recently buried to sell the bodies to doctors for a handsome price. The poor, often interred without a secure coffin or watchman, were disproportionately targeted by these ghoulish thieves, because of course they were. Even in the afterlife, the poor couldn't catch a break. The grim realities faced by London's underclass in death reflected the deprivations and oppression they endured in life. While the bereaved bourgeoisie paraded their mourning like a badge of dignified gentility, the poor scraped by with paupers' burials, the indignity of the resurrectionists, and little means to memorialize their losses. The cult of death, like so much in Victorian society, only highlighted the stark divides between the privileged and the powerless. But even as the Victorians venerated death with one face, a strange fascination with the spectacle of poverty arose among the well-to-do with another. The grim lives of London's poor became a voyeuristic curiosity for the wealthy, who engaged in a particularly condescending kind of tourism known as slumming. Guided by police escorts or enterprising locals, upper-class Londoners would venture into notorious slum areas like Whitechapel or the Rookeries of St Giles to observe how the other half lived. They gawked at residents eking out a living in cramped, crumbling tenements and sidestepped the sewage and filth clogging the streets. Some even played at dressing down to blend in, swapping silks and top hats for rough woolens and caps. Imagine the faux authenticity. Of course, these brief jaunts into the nether regions of London life offered only a sanitized glimpse of poverty, coloured by the comfortable distance of privilege. The wealthy could satisfy their lurid curiosity with an afternoon stroll through the slums before retreating back to their cosy carriages and elegant squares, leaving the poor to their plight. For the underclass, the deprivation and desperation the slummers viewed as a passing spectacle were an inescapable reality. That's not to say these poverty tourists were solely motivated by morbid titillation. Some, like social researcher Henry Mayhew and novelist Charles Dickens, yes, him again, aimed to document the conditions of the poor to spur action and reform. Mayhew's book, London, Labour and the London Poor, offered a groundbreaking and sympathetic study of street hawkers, beggars, and scavengers. Dickens drew on his own impoverished childhood to seed his novels with vivid, often sentimentalized portraits of workhouses and orphans. Writers and reformers like Mayhew and Dickens did help raise awareness of the plight of the poor, but progress was painstaking, and many Victorians remained apathetic or even hostile to aiding those they saw as lazy, immoral and undeserving. The squalid spectacle of slum life inspired more gawking than meaningful change for many years. Gradually, however, the sheer severity of the suffering began to stir the conscience of Victorian society. The combined efforts of crusading journalists, philanthropists, and newly formed charitable organisations cast a harsher light on the failures of Britain's vaunted empire to provide for its most vulnerable subjects. Small seeds of reform took root, though frustratingly slowly for those mired in misery. Religious missions like the Salvation Army, established in 1865, offered aid and ministered to the poor under the banner of Christianity, with its sleeves rolled up. They provided food, coal, shelter, and limited education to the needy, alongside a dose of evangelical preaching. Social activists like Dr. Thomas Barnardo, yes, we mentioned him, but he deserves another shout-out, and Lord Shaftesbury agitated for child welfare reforms, taking in street urchins and campaigning against the evils of child labour. The horrific housing of London's poor also drew the attention of social campaigners. American journalist Jacob Riis chronicled the squalid conditions in his muckraking classic, How the Other Half Lives, which spurred slum clearance efforts and the construction of model dwellings like the Peabody estates. While these tenements offered marginal improvements over the old rookeries, they still fell woefully short of providing truly humane housing, because, a slight improvement from rat-infested hovel to slightly less rat-infested box is still not quite dream home. Other gradual gains, like the Education Act of 1870, that allocated government funds for new schools, and the formation of settlement houses to aid poor families, mark tentative but important steps towards easing the burden of poverty. But the pace of progress failed to match the urgency of need, and hundreds of thousands of Londoners continued to subsist in wretched conditions for decades to come. It would ultimately take a public health catastrophe to spur one of the most transformative social reforms of the Victorian era. For years, London's primitive sanitation system had struggled to contain the massive amount of waste produced by the booming city. Human excrement and industrial runoff drained into rickety cesspools and crude sewers that emptied directly into the Thames, contaminating wells and spreading waterborne diseases like cholera. A truly charming ecosystem, wouldn't you say? The hot summer of 1858 brought this festering problem to a head in the form of the Great Stink. Unusually high temperatures, coupled with a lack of rainfall, left the river a stagnant, reeking soup of human and animal waste. The stench was so overpowering that sheets soaked in lime chloride were draped over the windows of Parliament in a futile attempt to keep the odious vapours at bay, with many politicians taking to carrying nosegays to suppress their gags. Imagine the scene: dignified gentlemen holding flowers to their noses, trying to debate the fate of the empire while battling the smell of, well, everything. Fears that the fetid miasma would spark another deadly cholera epidemic finally pushed legislators to act. They granted funding to the Metropolitan Board of Works to construct a groundbreaking network of brick-lined interceptor sewers and pumping stations, designed by Chief Engineer Joseph Bazalgette, to carry waste far downstream from the city centre. The southern outfall sewer alone stretched a staggering 7 miles long. Along the way, the Thames embankment was built to further beautify and sanitize the river. Completed in 1865, Bazalgette's pioneering sewer system was a massive feat of civil engineering that vastly improved public health and hygiene for Londoners of all classes. Cholera cases plummeted, and the noxious odour abated. The Thames began to recover from centuries of abuse. The benefits of this investment are still enjoyed by the city today, a rare bright spot of unequivocal progress amid the murky miseries of Victorian London. For despite the halting reforms and works of mercy, the poor still faced a harsh and heartbreaking reality. As the 19th century wound to a close, children laboured in dangerous factories and scavenged for scraps in scrapyards. Women sold matches and flowers for pennies, or resorted to prostitution to fill their bellies. Families wasted away in workhouses and rotted in rookeries. The very embodiment of this enduring suffering can be seen in the infamous murders of 1888. That year, a string of brutal killings shocked the city and cast a global spotlight on the festering underbelly of the empire's capital. At least 5 women, all poor prostitutes scraped from the streets of Whitechapel, were viciously murdered and mutilated by a shadowy figure who taunted police with mocking letters signed Jack the Ripper. The Ripper's savage crimes and the fumbling failure of authorities to catch the culprit embodied both the vulnerability of the underclass and the cruel indifference of the metropolis they struggled to survive in. As the fog swirled and the gaslight flickered over the gothic gloom of those damp autumn nights, one could almost imagine the city as a single organism, pulsing with life and death, indifferent to the insignificant souls swallowed up in its bowels. The ragged woman who drew her last breath in a dim alley, with a knife buried in her throat, was just one more scrap of human refuse churned up and spat out by the great, groaning machine of empire. The enduring horror and fascination with the Ripper murders, both then and now, is about more than the ghastly violence inflicted on a few unlucky prostitutes. It was the purest distillation of the everyday miseries and dangers that defined life for the poor. The casual cruelties, the crippling want, the gnawing despair that could be ended with the slash of a knife or a plunge into the Thames. The Ripper was never caught, but his victims achieved a grim celebrity in death they never enjoyed in their hard-knock lives. Their images and stories, however distorted and sensationalized, still flicker in the collective memory. a haunting reminder of a time when the shadows of London were truly terrifyingly dark. And so, my dear listeners, our epic, hour-long, or perhaps slightly more, who's counting, journey through the less than glamorous yet utterly fascinating underbelly of Victorian London comes to a close. Thank you for your ears, your patience, and for not abandoning me in a virtual alleyway. Until our next historical delve, stay curious, stay compassionate, and for goodness sake, appreciate modern plumbing. Good night, and may your dreams be free of both pea soupers and phossy jaw.